Chapter 694. Looking at the players who were sitting in rows on the raft, Ao Jian was astonished. Along the way in the field of Sword Dao, he encountered cruel scenes of mutual attacks, so he was really surprised to see such a harmonious scene at this moment. Especially when he noticed that the players were looking at the man with the giant sword with curiosity in their eyes. He felt that the scene did not match the environment he was in. "What are you waiting for? Hurry up and come to class." Sui Yi was displeased. He was thinking of finishing the class as soon as possible so that he could continue to comprehend the Sword Dao. He didn't want to waste any more precious time here. Ao Jian was stunned. After some thought, he steered the small boat closer to the raft to see what they were up to. The players on the raft were also astonished when they saw that it was Ao Jian. Almost all the players on the original server knew about Ao Jian. After all, he was one of the most famous members of the cheat group. His battle videos were included in the top teaching strategies in the battle skills category. He was recognized as a top-notch powerhouse by the players. Therefore, everyone subconsciously made way for him when they saw Ao Jian. At this moment, Roving Sword leaped up from the water and landed on the raft. He stood in a corner and did not choose to squeeze with the players. Seeing that, Sui Yi nodded in satisfaction. He looked at the players who were looking up at him and said solemnly, "All right, let's continue with the detailed explanation of the Sword Dao. All right, let's continue with the detailed explanation of swordsmanship. I hope that everyone can listen carefully. If there's anything you don't understand, feel free to ask me. I will answer them in detail." Seeing that everyone was ready, Sui Yi continued his lecture on the Sword Dao. Sui Yi was already familiar with the knowledge and could infer many things from one instance. He would even subconsciously ask the players if they understood during the lecture. Sometimes he would repeat the key points twice to ensure the quality of the lecture. He would even pick a few players to answer his questions to ensure that they really understood and were not just brushing him off. In order to save time, Sui Yi could be said to have mastered the essence of the teacher's lecture. Moreover, Sui Yi's resentful gaze when he met stupid students almost made some of the players suspect that they were back in school again. They were even a little nervous. The difference was that Sui Yi seemed to be more enthusiastic than the teachers and always cared if the players had learned it or not. Also, Sui Yi didn't know her teacher's trump card. "Call your parents over tomorrow," so Sui Yi would feel that he was very kind when they got along. The players were very touched by the bald teacher who was trying his best. Sui Yi was even more touched by the increasing number of students. He almost cried. The class soon ended. As Sui Yi smiled in relief, the players gathered a weak sword one after another. As for the students who still didn't understand, Sui Yi began to teach them individually, striving to make sure that all of them could pass and condense their graduation certificate, sword will. When all 38 of them had condensed their sword will, Sui Yi looked at the last person, Ao Jian. "Where's your sword intent? Haven't you learned it yet? Did you pay attention to my lecture just now? Even if you're stupid, why didn't you ask questions during the Q&A session just now?" At this moment, Sui Yi was so angry that he almost took out a blackboard and drew out the key points to vent his anger. Ao Jian. As a matter of fact, he listened very attentively when Sui Yi was teaching. Although Sui Yi was talking about the basic knowledge of sword cultivation, there were still many differences between what Ao Jian had learned and what he had learned. What shocked Ao Jian the most was that the content of Sui Yi's lecture was all about the key points of the method of condensing sword will. There were no lengthy lectures or other irrelevant knowledge points. It could be said that the content was refined to the extreme. Ao Jian admitted that he couldn't do that. After the lecture, Ao Jian also felt that he had benefited a lot, and many of his thoughts became clear. This caused him to think even more highly of Sui Yi's attainments in the Sword Dao. Sui Yi was absolutely a grandmaster in the Sword Dao, just as he'd thought. "Are you listening to me?" Ao Jian raised his head after his thoughts were interrupted. He looked at Sui Ye's disappointed eyes and decided to condense his sword will after some thought. In an instant, the new sword will that was integrated with nearly 200 sword wills was filled with the aura of many sword mysteries. Sui Yi immediately realized that it was extraordinary. You've already comprehended sword will. No, you've already devoured many sword wills in the realm. Sui Ye's expression changed when he saw this. He initially thought that Ao Jian was like the players in front of him, a newbie swordsman who had learned the wrong things. He did not expect that Ao Jian had already comprehended sword will and devoured many sword wills left by the underworld sword lord that he regarded as his own. At this moment, Sui Yi felt that he had been fooled. He immediately became angry out of humiliation. However, no matter what, these people had to die. This was because all the swordsmen in the realm were Sui Ye's competitors, and the final winner could only be himself. With that thought in mind, Sui Ye wasted no more time and unleashed an incredibly vast sword will wave from his body, blowing away the players' sword wills as if they were twigs. Then he swung his great sword and killed every single one of the players. However, when the sword aura was about to fall on Ao Jian, who was standing in the corner, Sui Ye's expression froze, and he suddenly withdrew the sword aura he released. This was because he realized that Ao Jian's sword will had yet to disperse. In other words, Ao Jian had yet to be defeated in the battle of sword wills. If Ao Jian was killed by the sword aura at this moment, all the remaining sword wills that he had obtained after working hard for nearly 2 months in the realm would be taken away. This was absolutely unacceptable to Sui Yi. After a cold snort, Sui Yi condensed his own sword will again and collided with Ao Jian's sword will. Bang! As expected, Ao Jian's sword will was instantly destroyed when it collided with the sword will that Sui Yi condensed from the sword principal divine seal. It could not resist at all. However, when Sui Yi was about to attack again to kill Ao Jian, a new wave of sword will suddenly appeared on Ao Jian's body. At this moment, Sui Ye's face was filled with disbelief. Sword will reassembled. Sui Yi, who did not believe it, attacked again and shattered Ao Jian's seemingly weak sword will. However, Ao Jian's expression remained the same. The new sword will in his body rapidly reassembled and grew like mushrooms after the rain. The moment it was formed, it did not weaken at all. When victory and defeat were no longer important, although Ao Jian's sword was no longer as sharp and indomitable as it used to be, it had an additional characteristic: indestructible. The battle between sword wills was like comparing who was the sharpest spear. In the competition, one side would definitely be defeated. However, Ao Jian would not have such worries. The sword will that was condensed from his passion for the sword allowed him to ignore victory and defeat. No matter how strong it was, he would not be shaken by the breeze. However, such a characteristic sword will also had a great weakness. Its power was certainly not as strong as other sword wills. It could even be considered as the weakest sword will of the same level. When fighting with an opponent of the same realm, although his opponent could not destroy his sword will, he could definitely be killed. However, in this sword principal realm, the only thing that was competing with each other was sword will, not their own strength. Under the favorable conditions, Ao Jian was almost invincible here. As long as his body was not destroyed, his sword would never be destroyed. Ao Jian relied on this characteristic to get stronger and stronger in the sword principal realm. He had also comprehended many sword wills to refine his body. Feeling the fluctuation of Ao Jian's sword will, Sui Ye's face was full of disbelief. This was a sword will that he had never seen before. Although it was sharp, there was no murderous aura. It was as if it was a reclusive person who had retreated from the mortal world and was not disturbed by the outside world. In the underworld, killing was for self-protection, for resistance, for promotion, and so on. No one could stay out of it. How could there be such a sword will? Sui Yi could not figure it out. Looking at Ao Jian, who had condensed his sword will again, Sui Yi, who did not believe it, showed a ferocious expression and began to attack Ao Jian's sword will again and again. Smash, condense, time passed bit by bit. After dozens of attempts, Sui Yi understood one thing, no matter how unbelievable it was. It was impossible for him to defeat Ao Jian's sword will. Because his sword will had no edge, it could not be defeated. Sui Yi, who realized this, was unwilling because there was only one choice in front of him. That was to kill Ao Jian. If Ao Jian was allowed to grow here, his potential would be immeasurable because his growth was based on being undefeated. No matter how slow his growth was, he would eventually grow to a terrifying realm by relying on the many sword wills left by the underworld swordsmen. At this moment, Sui Yi gave up the battle of sword will and decisively pulled out the giant sword on his back. He looked at Ao Jian and said, I, Sui, have never accepted a disciple in my life because my sword will symbolize freedom and I don't want to have too many concerns. However, you are the only one who made me cherish talent. You are a person who truly loves swords. Apart from you, all the swordsmen I have met have their own pursuits and goals. None of them have such a pure love for swords like you. I want to take you as my sword disciple. After pausing for a while, Sui Yi continued to say, but it's a pity that we met here. You're blocking my way forward. At this point, Sui Yi suddenly waved his hand and a violent sword aura swept forward, shredding Ao Jian's body. After retrieving the giant sword, Sui Yi immediately felt a vast power of the sword principle descending upon him. It invaded the sword principle divine seal and began to deprive him of all the sword wills left by the underworld swordsman because he had violated the rules of the battle of sword wills. Sui Yi's eyes were cold. He already knew the result the moment he made the decision. However, he did not regret his choice because Ao Jian had to be eliminated. Otherwise, this person would be the biggest obstacle and competitor for him to obtain the inheritance of the underworld swordsman. When all the sword wills that he had painstakingly refined dissipated, Sui Yi could not help but sigh with a hint of regret in his eyes. However, he did not know whether the regret was due to Ao Jian's death or the dissipation of the condensed sword wills, or both. 3 hours later, in the mansion of the dead, Ao Jian's figure appeared in the resurrection area. When everything around him became clear, Ao Jian had a smile on his face. In reality, he did not have the intention to compete with Sui Yi for the inheritance. He only wanted to explore the endless mystery of sword wills. To him, the sword principle domain was like the library of the sword principle. It contained a lot of knowledge that he desired. It was very attractive to him and he would not give it up. After trying to contact Mo Lanlan and Mo Xiaoxin, Ao Jian felt helpless when he still did not get a reply. He then walked toward the direction of the city gate and once again set foot on the path to the sword principle domain. Chapter 695. After killing Ao Jian, Sui Yi continued to explore the sword Dao domain, searching for and absorbing the sword will left behind by the underworld sword venerable. Along the way, his sword intent became stronger and stronger, and its sharpness was threatening. At this moment, Sui Yi could release sword aura with just his gaze. His entire body was filled with a terrifying sharpness. However, whenever he encountered other players, Sui Yi's cold aura would be instantly shattered, and he could only be a teacher obediently. After all, it was not easy to obtain the sword will. He could not violate the taboo of the domain again. During this period of time, Sui Yi had no idea how many disciples he had taught. From private lessons to public lessons, his teaching skills were getting more and more solid. However, Sui Yi was not happy at all. He was also filled with doubts. He really wanted to know how the sword master in the sea region, who misled the students, managed to trick so many idiots into learning the method of condensing sword will from him. Of course, he had no way of knowing. However, he was prepared to find that sword master once he inherited the sword venerable's inheritance. He would teach him a lesson and let him know what professionalism was, and then kill him in the cruelest way possible. As he continued to move forward into the Sword Dao domain, Sui Yi gradually felt the pressure. Although the Sword Dao Divine Seal kept getting stronger, the closer he got to the center, the more complete the sword seals he encountered. Just now, he encountered a complete sword seal. Wave-breaking sword seal. This sword seal, formed by sword, was obtained by the Sword Venerable after he was apotheosized. It was essentially no different from his own divine seal. Although the Sword Venerable was no longer controlling it, the explosive power of this sword seal still made it difficult for Sui Yi to deal with. As the sword wills clashed, they were even for a short period of time. Fortunately, he won in the end. He shattered the sword seal, absorbed it, and converted it. However, Sui Yi dared not be careless after this encounter, because the Sword Venerable's sword was far more than that. Thinking of the Sword Venerable's 3 most powerful techniques and the Sea God sword that he finally learned from the Sword Dao Law, Sui Yi knew that he had to improve his strength here as soon as possible. With this thought in mind, Sui Yi continued to wander around the center of the domain and began to search for sword wills. He would challenge and absorb them, trying his best to grow his sword will so that he could face stronger opponents. During this period, Roving Sword also stepped into the Sword Dao domain. However, his comprehension of sword intent did not start from scratch. Although there was a law in the sword principle field, this law could be said to be above all swordsmen and sword seals. All those who broke the law and failed would have all the sword essences they had obtained here taken away. However, Ao Jian was different, because he was a player. His backer was Lu Wu, and his soul was the battle artifact that was imprinted in Lu Wu's hand. Although the rule of the sword was strong, it was absolutely impossible to invade Ao Jian's soul as a player and deprive him of the power he had obtained. Lu Wu, have you asked me? Therefore, even though he was killed, his sword intent was not affected at all and was firmly preserved. Once again, stepping into the field of swordsmanship, Ao Jian immediately steered the boat deeper into the field. However, challenges soon came to him. This time it was not Sword Seal who challenged Ao Jian, but countless swordsmen who entered the field of swordsmanship after hearing the news. At this time, the outermost wandering sword seals had basically been divided up by the swordsmen, so their targets had changed from sword seals to other swordsmen. Relying on the enhancement of the Sword Dao domain, they could completely deprive others of their sword intent to enhance themselves. Although it was very cruel to do so, it was nothing in the face of benefits. In order to obtain the final victory, many swordsmen had already given up their bottom line as long as they could become stronger. Ao Jian faced this calmly because he was not afraid of any challenge at all. During this period, apart from the swordsmen, Ao Jian often met players. However, these players obviously had no intention of challenging him. They would try to greet him when they saw him and then leave in a hurry. It seemed that they were looking for something. Along the way, Ao Jian also saw many sword and tent battles between the players and the swordsmen. However, it was obvious that the players would not play by the rules. Often, after losing the sword and tent battle, they would raise their fists, wands, and so on and immediately fight their opponents head-on. This was because they did not have the habit of waiting for death. As for the rules, the player clan never followed the rules. Ao Jian was not surprised by this and continued to calmly board the boat and go deeper. After 3 days, the boat pushed through the heavy fog and arrived at the area where he died. At this time, Sui Yi had already left. The surroundings were quiet and there was a faint sound of rippling water. Looking at the small map in the upper right corner, Ao Jian did not stop and chose to continue moving forward. The boat moved forward very slowly. During this period, Ao Jian constantly used his sword heart to explore the surroundings to feel if there was any fluctuation of sword intent. The deeper he went, Ao Jian found that the number of swordsmen decreased and the number of sword seals also decreased. However, every time he encountered a swordsman or sword seal, it would be a difficult battle. However, this aroused Ao Jian's inner enthusiasm, because the more profound the sword intent, the more he wanted to explore and understand. Relying on the characteristic of the immortal sword intent, Ao Jian comprehended several sword intents left by the underworld sword venerable, while the boat gradually approached the central area of the domain. The water rippled and the fog filled the air. Ao Jian carried the 9 spiritual swords on his back and comprehended with his eyes closed. Suddenly, 2 powerful sword essences came from afar, and Ao Jian opened his eyes. Following the direction of the sword intents, Ao Jian moved his mind, and the boat immediately sailed in that direction. Pushing through the heavy fog, 2 figures appeared in front of Ao Jian. One of them was very familiar to him. It was Sui Yi. The other person was wrapped in golden light, and his face was blurred. He was floating on the water with his hands behind his back. In front of them, a giant green sword and a small golden sword were colliding and fighting. The dispersing sword was so powerful that just the aftermath had instantly destroyed the sword in Ao Jian's body that was approaching. Seeing the 2 people fighting, Ao Jian immediately stopped moving forward and began to watch from afar. During the fight, Sui Ye's forehead was dripping with sweat, and he seemed to be struggling. The other figure did not move at all. It was easy to tell who had the upper hand. The fight lasted for about an hour. Suddenly, Sui Yi took a few steps back with a pale face. The giant green sword trembled and made a sword sound. "Old thing, you're already dead. Why don't you let me inherit your swordsmanship?" Sui Yi looked at the golden figure and scolded angrily. "I've told you before that you're not suitable to inherit my swordsmanship." When he heard that, Sui Ye's face twisted, and he looked unwilling to give up. "My swordsmanship is the sword of freedom. It's unrestrained and can smelt any sword intent. Why can't I? Freedom itself already represents a kind of main sword intent attribute. You should explore and break through the path in the future by yourself, instead of looking for shortcuts. Only then can you go further. I don't need it. I only want your sword intent." Sui Yi roared angrily. Hearing this, the golden figure sighed and waved his hand. The small golden sword shot out and knocked the giant green sword back into Sui Ye's hand. "Retreat. Anyone can obtain my sword intent, but only you can't." At this moment, Sui Ye's face showed a touch of desolation. The reason why he was not allowed to inherit the swordsmanship inheritance was so that he could go further. He could not accept this reason. Sui Ye's eyes gradually turned red. Then, he suddenly threw the giant sword in his hand. Suddenly, thousands of sword intent phantoms condensed around him and hit the small golden sword with the giant sword. Boom! The powerful sword intent fluctuations caused the sea to surge. Ao Jian, who was far away, was also affected. The sword intent that was formed was instantly erased. "Since you don't want to give it to me, I'll take it from you. I couldn't do anything to you when you were alive, but now I'm the one in charge." Boom! Accompanied by Sui Ye's roar, a giant green sword cut through the barrier of the swordsmanship domain and descended from the sky, piercing the golden figure. So powerful! Feeling the sword intent aura, Ao Jian was horrified. "Old thing, die for me." The giant sword collided with the golden figure. Dazzling lights flashed, and the golden figure quickly melted under the blow, revealing its real body. At this moment, Ao Jian was shocked to find that it was a sword seal and not a real person. Feeling puzzled, Ao Jian immediately looked at the golden sword seal and activated his analysis ability. See God sword complete. Sword intent details. One of the 3 venerables of the Netherworld Chamber of Commerce. The strongest sword intent in Venerable Sword's life. After breaking through to the ancient god realm, Venerable Sword once stepped into the Central Sea territory near the 6 paths of reincarnation to comprehend a sword intent that matched his realm. He cultivated in seclusion for 5,000 years, integrated all the sword intents of the sea attribute, and created his own sword intent, Sea God Sword. Sword Intent Level. Rule Sword Intent. When the Sea God Sword Seal collided with the giant sword condensed by Sui Yi, countless golden lights flashed. The golden sword intent continued to solidify and pushed back the giant sword bit by bit. Boom! The giant sword could not withstand the impact, and cracks appeared on its surface. However, Sui Yi still clenched his teeth and persevered. Even though he knew the consequences of failure would be a setback to his sword intent, he still wanted to win, and he had to win. Because this was a shortcut. As long as he succeeded, he would be the next venerable sword of the Acheron Chamber of Commerce. This was the peak that he longed for the most, and it was also the peak that he had been pursuing all his life. Stop! If you continue, your sword intent will shatter. At this moment, a voice came from beside him, causing Sui Ye's heart to tremble. He immediately turned around and was shocked to find that this person was the swordsman that he had killed some time ago. Wasn't he dead? Sui Ye's mind was in a mess, and the giant sword condensed by his sword intent was pushed back by the golden sword seal. The giant sword that was covered with cracks flew back to Sui Yi and was then absorbed into his body. Sui Yi then turned around to look at Ao Jian and said coldly, "You're not dead?" Ao Jian nodded. "Not dead. Why are you stopping me now?" Even an outsider like me can see that if you continue, you'll definitely lose, and your sword intent will definitely be affected. I don't know why you're persevering in a battle of sword intent where you're bound to lose, but I can see that you know the owner of this sword seal, so you seem to be taking a gamble, betting that the owner will choose to compromise. Sui Ye's heart skipped a beat, and his face was filled with disbelief, because what Ao Jian said was exactly what he was thinking. If it was an external enemy, he would definitely compromise in a situation where he was bound to lose, and the owner even gave him a way out. The reason why he was so persistent this time was that he was gambling that the sword seal that still had the consciousness of the venerable sword would compromise. Give up? I can feel the emotions in this sword seal. Even if you have a close relationship with the owner of this sword seal isn't the real body after all, and the consciousness left by the owner is only a part of it. It's not as simple as you think. If you lose the gamble, you'll be destroying yourself. Hearing this, Sui Ye's expression was complicated, and his eyes were filled with uncertainty. He subconsciously turned his head to look at the sword seal. At this moment, the sword seal had once again turned into a blurry golden figure. It looked familiar, but lacked a lot of meaning. How can you feel the emotions in the sword seal? How did you do it? Sui Yi turned his head to look at Ao Jian and asked. The repeated failures in this area allowed me to understand every sword seal more thoroughly. Just like that, I gradually comprehended this ability through the contact with the sword seal. Ao Jian answered without hiding anything. Chapter 696. Sui Yi was shocked by Ao Jian's words. If what Ao Jian said was true, it meant that he could comprehend the sword essence that Sui Yi had yet to comprehend. That was incredible to Sui Yi. He also absorbed the underworld sword venerable's sword essence in the sword principal field, but he defeated it, then absorbed and digested it. Although it was simple and crude, it was also very effective. However, Ao Jian, who relied on repeated failures to understand the sword essence in the sword seal and then comprehend the essence, had already surpassed him in terms of realm and level. Sui Yi thought that he was talented and he could do it too. However, it required a lot of time and experience, and he could not do it as easily as Ao Jian. So at this moment, Sui Yi looked at Ao Jian differently, reading the sword seal and comprehending the essence of the sword essence. Could it be that he could fit with any sword essence? Then, how did he forge his sword heart? Sui Yi was full of doubts and found the key to the problem. From Sui Ye's point of view, it had nothing to do with the talent of sword essence, but the sword heart. A swordsman's sword heart was the foundation. The sword essence was the power condensed by the sword heart, and the sword chi was the materialization of the released power. The sword heart affected the attribute of the sword essence, and the sword essence affected the power of the sword chi. They were closely related. Since Ao Jian could fit with any sword essence, he must have a sword heart that could bear the sword essence of any attribute. Just when Sui Yi was puzzled, Ao Jian suddenly looked at Sui Yi and said, "Do you want me to try?" Sui Yi naturally knew what Ao Jian meant by try. Absolutely impossible. He immediately opened his mouth and chose to refuse. He even had the urge to kill Ao Jian with his sword again. Such a hidden danger would always be a threat if it was not removed. However, Sui Yi knew that he could not do that now, because he could not defeat the sea god's sword seal. If he killed Ao Jian here, he would be deprived of a large amount of hard-earned sword essence. By then, he would not be a match for the sea god's sword seal. Ao Jian thought about it, took a step back, and made a gesture of please. Seeing Ao Jian's action, Sui Ye's face turned pale. After listening to Ao Jian's words, he was no longer as determined as before, so he naturally did not want to go forward and be thwarted. The atmosphere suddenly became awkward. After a while, Sui Yi suddenly asked the question in his mind, "Why are you still alive?" Sui Yi was sure that Ao Jian must have been killed by him. Otherwise, the punishment from the sword principle law would not have appeared. Although the indestructible sword will shocked him, he could barely accept it. However, the resurrection of the dead was very strange, and he couldn't think of any reason for it. "You want to learn? I'll teach you." Ao Ran smiled. "You." Sui Yi raised his giant sword in anger, but then put it down again, choosing to endure it. Thinking about how he had told Ao Jian that he wanted to take him as a sword disciple, Sui Yi felt that Ao Jian's words were extremely ironic. "Actually, even if you don't let me try, I still have to try. I'm looking forward to the sword essence of the rule." Ao Jian looked at the sword master mockingly and then walked towards the sea god's sword seal. Seeing this, Sui Yi suddenly raised the giant sword in his hand and pointed it at Ao Jian. This was his inheritance. All competitors who wanted it had to die. However, no matter how ruthless Sui Yi was, he couldn't swing his sword. This was because the price to pay was too great. If he lost these precious sword wills, it would take a long time to get them back. After hesitating for a moment, Sui Yi stared at Ao Jian fiercely, put the giant sword back on his back, and watched coldly. He didn't believe that Ao Jian could get the sea god's sword seal. Even if his sword heart could contain all the attributes of sword will, it was impossible, because he was sure that Ao Jian couldn't bear such a vast sword essence of the rule. After all, whether the sword heart could integrate with the sword will was one thing, and whether it could contain it was another thing. Sui Yi kept comforting himself, and at the same time, he cursed Ao Jian with his eyes. He couldn't get it. Naturally, Ao Jian didn't care about the look behind him. He calmly walked to the front of the sea god's sword essence, and then issued a sword will challenge. Unlike Sui Yi, the sea god's sword essence didn't talk too much with him, and directly launched an attack. At this moment, Ao Jian felt that the world in front of him had changed. Everything in front of him was spinning crazily. When it became clear again, Ao Jian found that he had become a skinny little boy. Ao Jian immediately raised his head and looked around. He was shocked to find that he was surrounded by endless yellow sand, and the sky was full of sand and dust. At this moment, Ao Jian suddenly felt very thirsty. He subconsciously licked his dry and cracked lips, and only felt that his throat was about to smoke. Looking up at the scorching sun above his head, Ao Jian tried to concentrate and get out of this illusion. However, no matter how hard he tried, nothing in front of him changed. "I'm so thirsty." At this moment, Ao Jian felt that he was very close to death, and a strong desire to survive was born in his body. He began to search the surroundings, looking for a water source. However, there was endless yellow sand around him, and there was no water source. Under the scorching sun, Ao Jian finally couldn't hold on any longer and suddenly fell to the ground. At this moment, a figure appeared in front of him. It was an old man who was as skinny as him, but his haggard face revealed a strong desire to survive. The old man didn't say anything, but reached out to carry him, and then began to walk forward step by step. After an unknown period of time, Ao Jian was put down after a bumpy journey. At this moment, Ao Jian only felt that his vision was blurred, and it was a vast expanse of whiteness. His perception of the outside world also became unclear. At this moment, a mouthful of coolness was suddenly poured into his mouth. Ao Jian immediately began to desperately absorb this coolness, as if he was absorbing life force. After a while, Ao Jian slowly recovered and finally saw everything around him clearly again. At this moment, he found himself in a cliff pit, and the old man was grabbing a vine-like plant, twisting it hard. The coolness from before was also the liquid that dripped from this plant. Seeing that Ao Jian had woken up, the old man grinned, and then looked at the plant with a strong desire in his eyes. He then threw it into his mouth and chewed it little by little. Ao Jian didn't say anything and looked around. He really wanted to know how he fell into such a realistic illusion when he was obviously in a confrontation of swordwool. At this moment, the old man spat out the plant residue, stood up, carried Ao Jian, and walked out of the cliff pit again. He faced the sandstorm and continued to move forward. Ao Jian didn't speak during this journey, and he didn't know how long he had been dehydrated. Whenever he spoke, his throat would hurt and itch, and he could only make a noise. Along the way, the day and night changed 5 times, and the environment along the way was very harsh. The temperature difference between day and night was huge, like the difference between ice and fire. The old man had been taking care of him and struggled to move forward with him. During this period, the old man also fell down several times, but he still struggled to stand up and carried Ao Jian forward. Ao Jian couldn't imagine how this thin and weak body could nurture such a powerful force, and what was it that supported him to move forward? Moreover, Ao Jian found that his body seemed to be different from a human's, and it would adjust according to the environment. If it was a human body, he suspected that he would have died long ago. On the 18th day, after enduring the extremely cold night, the sky was dimly lit, and the temperature was getting warmer. The old man carried Ao Jian again, and continued this journey that seemed to have no end. However, halfway through the day, the old man suddenly fell down again. Ao Jian silently watched the old man, waiting for him to stubbornly get up again. However, this time, the old man didn't get up again. Instead, he raised his head and said in an extremely hoarse and harsh voice, "Amu ahegasi." At this moment, the old man's dim eyes burst out with indescribable desire and expectation. See, Ao Jian's heart trembled. At this moment, he knew what the old man's purpose was. Was he looking for the sea? The old man slowly stretched out his hands, trembling as he grabbed the air in front of him. See, Amu. See. Ao Jian couldn't bear it and stood up tremblingly. He wanted to help the old man up and move forward. At this moment, the old man's arms hung down weakly, but before he died, there was still an infinite desire for the sea left in his eyes. Looking at the old man whose eyes were full of hope, Ao Jian was silent and he didn't feel good. At this moment, the scene in front of Ao Jian suddenly changed rapidly. In the blink of an eye, he found that he had become a 13 or 14-year-old teenager, and his body was no longer shriveled, although he still looked very thin. Everything that happened just now was like a dream. Thinking of this, Ao Jian immediately looked around and was surprised to find that he was on an island. In the distance, there was a golden beach, a turquoise sea, and the rustling sound of the waves hitting the reefs. Everything seemed so beautiful. However, before Ao Jian could react, a figure suddenly appeared beside him, and then a whip was lashed on his body. Slacking off again, "Hurry up and get to work." Ao Jian felt a burning pain on his back after being whipped. He immediately wanted to take action, but before he could stand up completely, he was kicked to the ground. Subsequently, the whip lashed down continuously, and Ao Jian's skin and flesh were lacerated, dripping with blood. The attack was extremely heavy. In the end, Ao Jian fainted. After an unknown period of time, when Ao Jian woke up, he found himself in a dark cave, and the clanking sound of metal hitting stones could be heard continuously. He immediately struggled to get up and began to observe his surroundings. Suddenly, he found that there were many thinly dressed figures using tools similar to pickaxes, knocking on a kind of dark blue stone that was embedded in the rock wall. Every time they knocked off a piece, they would skillfully throw it into the wooden bucket behind them. At this moment, a figure appeared beside Ao Jian. Then, Ao Jian felt a pain in his chest, and he was whipped again. Get to work. The familiar voice belonged to the person who whipped him until he fainted. Naturally, Ao Jian was unwilling to give in. He glared at that person, and just as he expected, the whip lashed again and he fainted again. When he woke up again, Ao Jian found himself still in the dark mine shaft, and the supervisor with the whip in his hand was still there. Once again, his tenacious vitality allowed him to survive. When he woke up this time, Ao Jian realized that he was very eager to live. This feeling did not come from his heart, but from the feedback of his body. It was just like in the previous illusion, when he was absorbing the cool liquid that dripped from the plants, and he was extremely eager. Therefore, when the supervisor with the whip looked at him, Ao Jian did not hesitate to pick up the pickaxe on the ground and walked towards the busy crowd. This time, the work lasted for a few months, and during this period, Ao Jian had thought of going offline. However, the game notification was frowny face game notification. You are in the state of sword with confrontation, and you cannot exit. Forcefully exiting will cause the sword with confrontation to fail, and you will be forced to exit as a penalty, a large amount of experience and soul coins. Do you want to forcefully exit? Ao Jian, who really wanted to understand the rule of sword will, had no choice but to continue doing hard work. At the same time, he was guessing what this illusion had to do with the rule of sword will. During this period, Ao Jian suddenly had a guess. Could it be that I am experiencing the past of the underworld sword lord? Chapter 697. He had been in the dreamland for nearly 2 months. During this period, Ao Jian had never left the island. It was not that he did not want to go out, but he could not go out at all. He could only work in the dark mine shaft day after day. This kind of life made Ao Jian feel very annoyed, but he did not want to give up his desire for the sword essence of the law. During these 2 months, Ao Jian also tried to think about the reason for the existence of this dreamland. At this time, there were many speculations in his mind. Ao Jian felt that the most likely guess was that what he was experiencing now was the path that the underworld sword venerable had once walked. He still clearly remembered that when he was in the desert, the old man pointed to the distance with his trembling hand and shouted, "See, Amu." See, Ao Jian's analysis was that the old man wanted to take him to find the sea. However, in the end, the old man was exhausted and could no longer hold on. Although there was a longing for the sea in his eyes, he was eventually buried in the yellow sand. Thinking of his current appearance of 13 or 14 years old, it was obvious that he had grown up compared to before. Could it be that after the old man died, the young man set off again, relying on his tenacious will and extremely adaptable body to finally arrive at the seaside? Later on, for some unknown reason, he was taken to this island and became a slave. Ao Jian had no way of knowing whether this was the case. But if his guess was correct, then this trip to the dreamland would certainly not be ordinary. With such a mood, Ao Jian was looking forward to it. Every day, he made guesses and deliberated while working. During the days here, Ao Jian also found a very strange thing, which was that he had forgotten any cultivation method of sword essence. He originally wanted to rely on the knowledge of swordsmanship in his mind and the rich spiritual energy around him to recultivate so that he could have the strength to protect himself. However, all the knowledge of swordsmanship had disappeared from his mind, as if this memory was deliberately blocked. All of this made Ao Jian puzzled, and he could only wait for what might happen next. Another month passed as they waited. The days of mining were undoubtedly boring, although they did not have to worry about food and drink every day. In order to ensure their efficiency, a large amount of food would be sent to them every day. However, living in such an environment for a long time had a huge impact on their spirit. The eyes of the laborers beside him were lifeless, as if they had long given up resisting and had completely become tools. The reason why Ao Jian was able to hold on was that he had expectations in his heart and knew that all of this was fake. On this day, the sun rose. Ao Jian and the laborers were driven into the mine as usual and continued to work below. Halfway through his work, before it was time to eat, the ground suddenly shook and gravel fell from the mine. The sudden change shocked Ao Jian. The supervisor, who was patrolling not far away, was also shocked. He then shouted at Ao Jian and the others, "Continue working, don't be lazy," and walked out of the mine. Ao Jian was confused about this, but he did not stubbornly follow them out to have a look. After all, this place was heavily guarded and surrounded by the boundless sea. Relying on his strength, which had not even reached the ghost soldier realm, to escape was also a dead end. Soon, shouts and explosions could be heard from outside. It seemed like an intense battle was going on. Hearing these sounds, Ao Jian tried to communicate with the laborers around him. However, in the face of Ao Jian's words, these laborers looked numb and did not pay attention to him at all. While waiting, the sounds of fighting outside gradually calmed down, and at this time a figure walked into the mine. This person was not the supervisor that Ao Jian was familiar with, but a very burly man in green armor. "From today onwards, you are the laborers of my Iron Snake Island. Do you understand?" Hearing this, Ao Jian's face showed a look of realization. Fighting for resources, he also had some understanding of the history of this world from the forum. He knew that there were endless plundering and competition because of resources, and this was even the main theme of this world. It was indeed normal for a battle to break out because of resources. In the face of the man's question, Ao Jian and the laborers did not answer. They just looked at the man quietly. Their faces were numb. After being taken over by the Iron Snake Island, although Ao Jian was still a laborer, his days in the future had changed. The daily workload was 3 times heavier, and the time for sleep and rest was compressed by 3 times. This was completely an act of squeezing the vitality of the laborers. They did not consider the harvest of resources from a long-term perspective at all. They were completely trying to shorten the time possible and quickly plunder and harvest a batch of spiritual mineral resources. In this regard, Ao Jian and the laborers could not resist at all and could only continue to work according to the rules. Every day, there were laborers who fell down from the heavy work around them. Of course, the forces of the Iron Snake Island knew about this, but they did not care at all. Instead, they increased the workload again. Such an act made Ao Jian feel mentally and physically exhausted, but the strong vitality in his body allowed him to hold on. In less than a month, more than half of the laborers in the mine died, and the remaining few had completely lost the ability to continue working. Ao Jian was an exception. Although he also felt extremely tired, he still held on. That feeling was very strange. He clearly felt that he was about to die, but his body would always respond with a strong desire to survive, allowing him to hold on. This force could even affect Ao Jian's choice. With regards to this force, Ao Jian could only use 2 words to describe it: to live. Just like in the desert previously, the strong desire to survive made him subconsciously make the decision to live. After the death of most of the laborers, the Iron Snake Island did not replenish the number of new laborers. Instead, they gathered the remaining laborers one day, and the man in green armor appeared in front of them again. At this time, there were less than 10 laborers left. Among them, 9 had collapsed from the heavy work and completely lost consciousness. Only Ao Jian was still conscious. In fact, Ao Jian also wanted to pretend to be the same as these 9 people, and did not want to appear too different. However, he could not pretend at all. After being tested, he still gave himself away. However, what surprised Ao Jian was that what greeted him was not a severe punishment, but a question from the man in green armor. "Kid, you're not bad. Do you want to follow me?" As the man spoke, he reached out and rubbed Ao Jian's head with a smile on his face. Ao Jian was speechless. Ao Jian was speechless. He wanted to refuse, but the words that came out of his mouth were timid. "I want to live. I want to see the sea." "Ha ha ha, then follow me." Just like that, Ao Jian followed the man and left the island where he had lived for a few months. As for the resource island, the man obviously did not want to occupy it for a long time. Instead, he decisively abandoned it. Those laborers who had lost their abilities were also abandoned on the island. After getting along for a month, Ao Jian knew that the man's name was Iron Snake. He had formed a sea plundering force and wandered around the nearby sea. He developed by plundering resources and even occupied a resource island, which he renamed as Iron Snake Island. The days after that changed. Ao Jian no longer needed to work day after day in the dark mine cave. Instead, he lived on the Iron Snake Island. He was even called the third son by Iron Snake, and his treatment was greatly improved. Occasionally, he would go out to sea with Iron Snake, wandering and plundering in the sea. Every time they returned from plundering, there would be a carnival in the Iron Snake Island. They would eat meat and drink wine, and the smell of smoke and fire was strong. However, Ao Jian's favorite was to squat on the coast when he was resting, looking at the direction of the sea, enjoying the sunrise and sunset, and quietly watching the scenery of the sea and sky. Every time this happened, the hoarse voice of the old man and the longing for the sea that appeared in his eyes before his death would unconsciously appear in his mind. In fact, Ao Jian felt that although he sympathized with the old man, he would not miss him. However, this thought arose spontaneously, and he could not suppress it at all. Ao Jian's feeling towards the sea seemed to be inherited from the old man's obsession, which was full of yearning. Such days lasted for a period of time. One day, Iron Snake suddenly found Ao Jian and told him that if he wanted to survive in this world, strength was the foundation and he should grow up. In this regard, Iron Snake gave him a choice. He asked him to find a few deputy captains on the island and choose one to be his master to start his cultivation. Ao Jian did as he was told. There were a total of 3 deputy captains on the island. One was good at controlling the power of elements. One relied on the strong physical body of his race and was good at close combat, and the last one was eccentric but good at using a sword. With such a choice, Ao Jian naturally intended to choose the person who used the sword without hesitation. However, this time it was still not up to Ao Jian. The moment he chose to start, he was out of control. However, in the end, he still chose the person who used the sword, who was the weakest among the 3. The reason was also very simple. Ao Jian, who was out of control, asked the 3 who was stronger. The answer he got was the strongest one, who controlled the power of elements. At the same time, he also got an answer. If they were in the same realm, then the person who used the sword was definitely the strongest. Therefore, Ao Jian made a choice. He wanted the strongest person in the same realm. This choice made Ao Jian even more certain that this was the path that the underworld sword master had taken. In the days that followed, he began his swordsmanship cultivation. As all the knowledge of swordsmanship in his mind was blocked, he could only start from scratch. The first step was to condense the sword heart. Before starting this step, the deputy captain examined Ao Jian's body and came to a conclusion. If he wanted to go further, he had to condense the earth attribute sword heart among the 5 elements. Ao Jian chose to resist this step before he even started. This was because he hated the color yellow. It would remind him of the boundless yellow world, filled with sand and wind. To him, that place was more like a prison, filled with all kinds of unhappiness. Therefore, Ao Jian asked the deputy captain if he could choose the blue color, which was the sword essence of the water attribute. The deputy captain fiercely reprimanded Ao Jian and told him that if he took the first wrong step, he would no longer have any potential in the future, unless he took the initiative to shatter the sword essence and sword heart and start from scratch. In this regard, Ao Jian did not insist on anything. Instead, he silently accepted the guidance. The first step was the cultivation of swordsmanship. He had to accompany the long sword every day, observe the shape of the sword, and imprint it into his mind little by little. Ao Jian took this step very steadily. His desire for strength made him cultivate very seriously. This was because Iron Snake had told him that in this world, strength and survival were linked. If he wanted to survive, he had to be strong. Soon, Ao Jian's mind depicted the specific appearance of the long sword. At this time, he began to cast the sword heart under the guidance of the deputy captain. During this period, the deputy captain told him to try to meditate on the scene of yellow sand all over the sky and build a world in his heart that was closely related to the earth. It would be considered a success if he could smell the smell of the earth while meditating. However, when this step was initiated, Ao Jian's heart was full of resistance. He could not calm down to build the sword heart world of the earth attribute at all. Every time this happened, he would come to the seaside, quietly look at the sea, think about his troubles, and be intoxicated by the blue world after countless failures. Ao Jian was very disappointed, until one day he made up his mind to try to build a world of the sea. Although the deputy captain had warned him, Ao Jian still chose to go his own way. Different from the yellow world, the blue world was quickly built by him. The long sword in his heart also entered this world at this time. He had condensed the sword heart, but it was not the sword essence of the earth attribute. Instead, it was the water attribute that did not correspond to his own attribute. The moment the deputy captain heard the news, he cursed and beat him up. However, Ao Jian smiled because he liked the blue color and yearned for the sea. It was just that simple. As the deputy captain said, he had chosen the wrong path. His cultivation progress was extremely slow. It took a lot of time to condense the sword essence. The deputy captain also completely gave up teaching Ao Jian, thinking that this child was completely hopeless. However, Ao Jian was very happy. The improvement of his strength every day made him feel as if he was reborn, especially when he displayed the sword essence of the water attribute. The blue sword light that filled his body always made him feel as if he was in the sea. The continuous strengthening of the sword essence made Ao Jian feel as if the water in the pool was constantly increasing. He looked forward to the future when the water would converge into the sea. Such days continued for a long time. Ao Jian gradually grew up and his status also changed. He was no longer just an ordinary member of the island, but an official member of the pirate ship. He began to follow Iron Snake and the deputy captain out to sea to plunder. In fact, Ao Jian did not resist every time they plunder. This was because the idea instilled in him by Iron Snake was that if he wanted to live a better life, he must take what he wanted from the hands of others. The power of Iron Snake Island also grew rapidly in such plunder. It annexed several nearby small forces, and its members increased day by day. However, some things were destined to change. During one plunder, they encountered the attack of an extremely powerful force from the sea. On that day, Ao Jian saw countless ferocious sea beasts rolling on the sea, knocking over the ships and devouring the crew. Although he was lucky to escape in the end, Iron Snake was seriously injured in this battle. Since no one on the island had medical skills, they would usually choose to exile this seriously injured member in such a situation. They would throw him on the raft and let him drift away, quietly waiting for death to come. However, this time, the most important leader of Iron Snake Island was injured. Everyone panicked, including Ao Jian. They began to try to recover Iron Snake using poor methods. Perhaps because of this, Iron Snake, who could have lived for a while, was injured more seriously and reached the end of his life in advance. At this moment, the power of Iron Snake Island was no longer as cohesive as before. Who would be the leader became the biggest problem. The 3 deputy captains all wanted to be the leader. At the same time, Iron Snake's eldest and second sons also wanted to inherit the position. However, the members on the island were more inclined to let one of the 3 deputy captains become the leader. There is no such thing as inheritance rights in this world. Even if there was, it would be those super forces that cast the dynasty. Here, everything depended on strength. Because of their desires, Iron Snake's eldest and second sons were eventually exiled by the members of the island. However, Ao Jian stayed because he had no yearning for the leader's position and there was no conflict of interest. However, even so, the internal dispute of Iron Snake Island did not subside. Instead, it was fragmented. The 3 deputy captains led their respective supporters and divided Iron Snake Island into 3 forces. They started to fight for the ownership of the island. It was at that moment that Ao Jian chose to leave. He sat on a raft and drifted in the sea, because he did not like power and competition at all. What he wanted to do more was to gather the river in the Sword Heart world into the sea. Ao Jian's enthusiasm for the cultivation of sword intent did not come from his love for the sword, but his desire for blue. It was this desire that made Ao Jian want to continue to cultivate this sword intent. In the following days, he had no fixed residence. He became one of the many wanderers in this sea area. During this period, in order to learn a stronger sword intent, he joined many forces. He also learned many sword intents: water spirit sword, wave sword, ripple sword, vast sea sword. All the sword intents that he learned were related to the sea. Even though the learning process of each sword intent was extremely difficult, he never gave up and kept improving based on his passion. During this period, there were several time jumps. Every jump point was when he was learning a new sword intent. This also caused Ao Jian to be unable to sense how much time had passed. During this period, he returned to Iron Snake Island once. At this time, the leader of Iron Snake Island had already changed. It was not the 3 deputy captains that he knew, but an old man with white hair and a doddering appearance. Iron Snake Island was not as strong as it used to be. It seemed to be in the late stage of decay and was approaching the end of its twilight. Ao Jian had no impression of this person. From him, Ao Jian learned that 1,800 years had passed. The old man said that he still remembered Ao Jian Amu, because he was the 3rd son of Iron Snake and he used to be an ordinary member of Iron Snake's subordinate force. The old man told Ao Jian that countless people had died in the years of plundering, and he had grown into a leader step by step in such an environment. In the end, the old man could not help but ask Ao Jian why he had not aged. There was an end to the life of every creature, except for a few creatures with special forms. Only by constantly breaking through the realm could they obtain a stronger vitality. Otherwise, they would eventually step into the 6 realms of reincarnation and start over. At that time, Ao Jian's strength was only at the Ghost Supreme Commander. Although he was far from reaching the end of his life, why did he not age at all? Ao Jian could not answer this question. He was also very puzzled about this. Why did he, who was only at the Ghost Supreme Commander realm, not age at all? He could even feel the strong fluctuation of vitality in his body. Not only did it not decrease with age, it was getting stronger and stronger. Unable to answer this question, Ao Jian finally bid farewell to the old man and once again set foot on the road of cultivation. In the days that followed, Ao Jian searched everywhere for swords. Every time he jumped, Ao Jian would find himself starting a new cultivation journey. Time flew by quickly, but it did not leave any trace on Ao Jian's body. The forces in the nearby sea area changed and massacres happened every day, but Ao Jian never cared about it. Under Ao Jian's cultivation, the blue world in the heart of the sword converged into a river and gradually formed a lake. When he reached the Ghost King realm, he did not know how much time had passed. This was because his cultivation was far slower than others. He only relied on his passion to support others' seemingly boring or even strenuous cultivation of sword wool. At this time, Ao Jian had even forgotten whether he was Ao Jian or Amu in the passage of time. It seemed that other than the cultivation of sword wool, everything else had slowly faded. Another turning point of fate had also quietly arrived at this time. At that time, Ao Jian had already reached the Ghost Emperor realm. Although he kept a low profile, he was also a very well-known and powerful swordsman in the sea area. This was because he had already become a pioneer in swordsmanship and there were no more enemies in the sea area. On the road of seeking swords, he had already surpassed all the swordsmen in the sea area. This process was like a tortoise and a rabbit race. Although Ao Jian's cultivation progress was the slowest, he was definitely the most serious. He relied on the accumulated strength to surpass his former teachers or opponents little by little. This was not because Ao Jian's talent was superior. Everything could be summed up with the word hard work. Although other swordsmen were talented and had the corresponding sword heart, they were still bound by the secular world. Some swordsmen longed for power, some longed for a large number of resources to help them cultivate faster. They were warriors in the world of cruel competition, and there would always be a time when they would stop. However, Ao Jian did not. He focused on cultivating sword wool. Although the progress was slow, he did not stop at all. During this period, Ao Jian's strong vitality and unlimited desire for survival had also helped Ao Jian greatly. It gave him the capital to slowly move forward without thinking too much. However, the bottleneck had still arrived. After the Ghost Emperor realm, his strength could not be improved anymore. Even his body began to reject the heart of the sword. This problem could not be solved by Ao Jian with hard work. However, he did not give up and began to look for a solution. During this period, he tried many methods, but none of them produced any effect. The realm seemed to be stuck at the Ghost Emperor realm. Just when Ao Jian was distressed, he met the Acheron Chamber of Commerce. It was a battle of plunder. The largest plunder force in this sea region confronted the Acheron Chamber of Commerce. It was also at that time that Ao Jian met a person. He held a sword with one hand. When he raised his hand, heavy waves surged forward. Countless ships were swallowed up and smashed. Those members of the plunder force who seemed to be invincible in this sea region were so vulnerable in the face of the power of the sea. That sword was deeply imprinted in Ao Jian's mind. At that time, Ao Jian did not know where the courage came from. He flew to that person and wanted to ask for a sword. However, Ao Jian only received a cold word, "Get lost." Then the figure disappeared on the spot. However, that person's figure was imprinted in Ao Jian's mind. He swore that he must ask for a sword from that person and master the essence of his sword will, especially the sword that could trigger the power of the sea. In the days to come, Ao Jian's mind would often think of the graceful posture of that sword. Under the guidance of the sword will, the waves that were stacked and pushed forward were always replayed in Ao Jian's mind. Since there was no way to learn it, he would try to comprehend it. In this regard, Ao Jian began to practice hard and began to try. At the same time, he also began to look for that swordsman and explore this person's information. Usually, Ao Jian did not care about the composition of the sea region forces. However, this time he was particularly attentive. In the end, he learned that this person was Sword Master, one of the 3 supreme masters of the Acheron Chamber of Commerce. In order to get in touch with this person, The only way was to join the Acheron Chamber of Commerce and go to the Central Sea region of the Acheron. With his strength, it was not difficult to join the Acheron Chamber of Commerce. However, it was still far from being able to settle in the Central Sea region. Even if he went there, he would be at the bottom and would not be able to get in touch with Swordmaster. However, Ao Jian did not give up because he found a way. That was to become a war chamber of commerce. As long as he had enough strength, he would definitely be able to settle in the Central Sea region in the future and become one of the important forces under the headquarters of the Acheron Chamber of Commerce. With this idea, Ao Jian returned to Iron Snake Island. This was the place where he first started to practice. The leader had already changed several times. When he saw that old man again, all that was left of him was his cenotaph. At this time, Iron Snake Island was no longer the all-powerful force in the vicinity. Instead, it was reduced to the lowest level force with a scale of less than 100 people. Ao Jian came here and met the new leader. He explained his intention to create a powerful fleet. Facing Ao Jian, who was in the Ghost Emperor realm, the leader did not hesitate and chose to give his position to Ao Jian. Thus, the Iron Snake Fleet was established and began the path of killing. Along the way, blood and death accompanied each other. Ao Jian was seriously injured several times and almost died a few times. However, he still managed to hold on. His body had an endless desire to live, which could always pull him back from the edge of death. His sword intent was also constantly solidified in the killing. His growth and the growth of his forces were like a hurricane in this sea region, sweeping across and constantly plundering and strengthening. However, Ao Jian also had his own principles in plundering. That was to never touch the forces under the protection of the Acheron Chamber of Commerce, because that would be his next step. Finally, one day, when he felt that it was possible, he found the Acheron Chamber of Commerce branch in that sea region and expressed his intention to join it. His request was answered. The Acheron Chamber of Commerce quickly sent people to investigate and test his forces. Ao Jian, who came prepared, finally obtained the title of War Chamber of Commerce. In the days to come, all his efforts were to improve his position in the Acheron Chamber of Commerce and obtain the opportunity to enter the Central Sea region of the Acheron. Time slipped away. Time flew by. Amu's name resounded in the nearby sea region, and he became a powerhouse that no one dared to provoke. His Iron Snake fleet grew into the strongest chamber of commerce among the top 10 war chambers of commerce. During this period, Ao Jian had put in a lot of effort. However, the last step seemed to be close at hand, but it was out of reach. The Central Sea region was the habitat of the powerhouses. Even if he became the #1 war chamber of commerce in the branch, his strength was still far away from that step. His cultivation was getting slower day by day, and he had been stuck in the Ghost Emperor realm for a long time. The subordinates around him had also been replaced several times. They were their descendants, or even the descendants of their descendants. Time had faded his memory, but the descendants still followed him from generation to generation. During this period, he had experienced countless wars, even to the point of challenging the Acheron Chamber of Commerce. However, in the end, he got through them unscathed. Time had changed many things, but it did not change Ao Jian's original intention. In his memory, yellow sand filled the sky. He saw a touch of blue in the old man's eyes. Turbulent waves surged in his eyes. Longing to touch it, his trembling hand grasped the air at the last moment of his life. But what he got was still a handful of yellow sand. Ao Jian inherited this obsession. He wanted to cast the sea of sword will in his heart. Even if the road ahead was full of difficulties, he would never give up. The only thing that kept him going was his passion, so he would not feel tired or mentally tired. As time passed, the war would never stop. Another huge challenge was coming. It was a super force that spanned across many seas. This force aimed at the Acheron Chamber of Commerce. There were many powerhouses in the divine realm under their command. They launched attacks with several branches of the Acheron Sea region at the same time and formed a crushing advantage. In front of this force, Ao Jian felt how small he was. It was the first time he fought against an opponent in the demigod realm. In this battle, Ao Jian was seriously injured and his subordinates suffered heavy losses. It was also that battle that made Ao Jian have a breakthrough. At the juncture of life and death, he thought of the sword master. The desire to live unlocked all of Ao Jian's potential. At that moment, he had an epiphany. With a wave of his hand, he mobilized the power of the sea and slashed out the sword that he had practiced countless times in his mind. The sea roared and collapsed, overlapping and moving forward. The infinite sword was locked on the powerhouse in the demigod realm. That touch of blue was amazing. When the blue light faded, the seemingly invincible opponent had fallen. It was also that sword that made Ao Jian break through the demigod realm and gain the opportunity to go to the Central Sea region of the Acheron. This sword was called the Wave Stacking Sword by Ao Jian. It was also a key turning point in his life. In the end, the force that faced the Acheron Chamber of Commerce was wiped out after the Acheron headquarters in the Central Sea region intervened. At that time, Ao Jian also moved into the Central Sea region in the name of the War Chamber of Commerce. In the end, he met the sword master as he wished and became his sword disciple. In the days that followed, under the guidance of the sword master, Ao Jian practiced hard. The bottleneck he once faced faded away, and he even became one of the 8 sword envoys under the command of the sword master. However, the sword master told Ao Jian that his potential was limited after all. He had forged a sword heart that was incompatible with himself. The divine realm was the end, and it was impossible to move forward. At that time, the sword master persuaded Ao Jian to reforge his sword heart. It was not too late to change before he condensed the sword principle divine seal. However, Ao Jian did not give up. He knew that he relied on his passion to get to where he was now. If he had chosen the earth attribute sword heart, he would not be where he was now. Although the process was long and the progress was slow, Ao Jian clearly understood what he relied on to get to where he was now. If he started over again, perhaps the progress of his cultivation would be faster because he had a very rich knowledge of sword principle. However, without that passion, he also lost the ambition to forge the sword heart world into the sea. As time went by, in the Central Sea region where danger lurked everywhere, battles between peak experts often happened. Even the Acheron Chamber of Commerce had to be cautious here. Ao Jian also grew rapidly under such an environment and the supply of resources from the Acheron Chamber of Commerce, until one day a bad news came. The sword master was killed by an ancient god from the opposing forces at the edge of the 6th Tao of reincarnation due to the fight for resources. The entire Acheron Chamber of Commerce was shocked. It was also at this time that Ao Jian and the other 7 famous swordsmen received an order. One of them must take over the position of the sword master. At that time, no one was optimistic about Ao Jian because he was the weakest among the 8 famous swordsmen. Regardless of talent or cultivation progress, he could not be compared to the other 7. Just when Ao Jian was still shocked by the news of the sword master's death, he suddenly felt the world shake and then found himself in the sword principle field. Not far away, Sui Yi was staring at him fiercely with eyes full of killing intent. At this moment, memories came one after another, and the memories in the illusion gradually faded. Although he could still remember some of it, it was as if it was covered with a layer of gauze and became blurred. How long has it been? Ao Jian suddenly turned to look at Sui Yi and asked, "What do you mean, how long has it been? Why don't you challenge me?" Sui Yi said with a look of disdain, "Ao Jian." At this moment, Poseidon's sword seal burst forth with a vast power and violently hit Ao Jian. Game notification. Sword will confrontation failed, damage received. 2756261 points. You have died. Game notification. Obtain 2% rule of sword will. This challenge failed. Please keep up the good work and continue the challenge. Sui Yi, who was not far away, saw that Ao Jian was killed by the rule of sword will. He was stunned at first, but then he smiled happily. It was good that he was dead. It was good that he was dead. Chapter 698. It was only a few seconds, but it felt like a very long time. As Ao Jian woke up from the state of sword will struggle, the illusion was broken and the long memory in his mind faded away. Ao Jian was very confused about this and could not remember what he had encountered in the illusion. Lu Wu, who saw this scene, nodded his head in satisfaction. It was because he was the one who manipulated everything behind the scenes. This was the sword seal of the underworld swordsman, which was condensed by the water sword that he had learned all his life. It still contained the consciousness of the underworld swordsman and had not completely dissipated. In fact, Ao Jian's guess was right. This illusion allowed Ao Jian to relive the memory of the underworld swordsman. The difference was that except for a few important turning points, all the decisions were made by Ao Jian. If Ao Jian finished the memory of the underworld swordsman, then this memory would remain in Ao Jian's mind. Although he was still Ao Jian at that time, he would recognize himself as the underworld swordsman. This was because the memory of the underworld swordsman was not as simple as Ao Jian had thought. Although Ao Jian's original memory would not be erased after going through the memory of the underworld swordsman, there was no meaning for his existence, which was equivalent to nothing. Ao Jian had lived for as long as the underworld swordsman had lived. Compared to the memory of the underworld swordsman, Ao Jian's memory was like a drop in the ocean, not worth mentioning at all. This was because Ao Jian's memory was only a few decades old. In contrast, the memory of the underworld swordsman was like a vast ocean. The memory droplets that dripped into it would inevitably be engulfed and covered. When Ao Jian had lived in the illusion for millions of years, the first few decades would become inconspicuous, like dust in the corner, and he would not even think about it. Therefore, Ao Jian gradually forgot who he was in the illusion. He only remembered that he was pursuing the ocean of sword will and thought that he was Amu. When he first entered the illusion, Ao Jian might still have doubts and speculations. However, with the passage of time and the accumulation of experience, coupled with the passage of time, he had long forgotten who he was in the past. This was because that memory was too short, it could even be described as insignificant. This was also the reason why Lu Wu chose to take action. It could be said that Ao Jian's memory had been completely overwritten by the memory of the underworld swordsman before he exited the illusion of the sword will competition. Although the real underworld swordsman had died, Ao Jian would be the new underworld swordsman because they had the same memories. Although this was not the resurrection of the underworld swordsman, it was equivalent to a clone. It had the same memories, the same sword will, the same mental journey, and so on. Even though the real underworld swordsman was dead, Ao Jian was no longer Ao Jian. Naturally, Lu Wu would not sit idly by and do nothing about it. He took decisive measures. Therefore, when Ao Jian withdrew from the illusion of sword will competition, the long memory and experience in his mind would gradually fade and be covered, and he could no longer remember what it was. The purpose of this was to protect Ao Jian so that he would not lose himself. Of course, Lu Wu was still looking forward to Ao Jian defeating and obtaining the law of sword will. After all, his heavenly demon list was currently collecting the power of laws, so this rule sword intent could be used. Moreover, as a player, Ao Jian had the ability to resurrect infinitely. Moreover, Lu Wu was helping him conceal his memory behind the scenes, so this method was completely feasible. It was just that he might have to work harder. 3 hours later, Ao Jian's figure appeared at the resurrection point in the mansion of the dead. This time he did not stop at all. He decisively walked to the city gate, arrived at the Liuli coast through the teleportation point, and then set off for the Kendo domain. The sudden failure and death stunned Ao Jian, but the 2% mastery of the law of sword will made him feel excited. He only remembered that he had entered a dreamland after the sword will competition of Poseidon's sword seal was activated. The memory after that was a blur. It seemed that he had experienced many things and met many people, but he could not remember the specific matters no matter how hard he tried. When he suddenly woke up, everything faded, but the sword that he had mastered in the dreamland remained in his heart of the sword. Therefore, Ao Jian wanted to go to the Kendo domain again to challenge Poseidon's sword will. He wanted to see what was in the dreamland, and why his heart of the sword and sword will had such a huge change. After a few days of sailing, Ao Jian once again stepped into the Kendo domain. At this time, the Kendo domain was full of competition as usual. Swordsmen and players were everywhere, as the bald mentor could not be found, and it was extremely difficult to enter the central area of the Kendo domain. The players turned their attention to the other swordsmen who had stepped into the Kendo domain. This time, it was not Sueya who was devastated. The other swordsmen were also challenged by the players, and became the players' whetstone for the growth of their sword will. Ao Jian did not pay too much attention to this, and steered the boat all the way into the Kendo domain. During the few days of sailing, Ao Jian had experienced 7 challenges. However, during the sword will competition, Ao Jian found that his sword will was attached with a water attribute power, and his sword will had undergone a qualitative change. Compared to when he had mastered Relentless Sword, the strength of his sword will had increased by 10 times. He had also become proficient in the use of sword will and the release of sword chi, as if his heart of the sword had been reborn. Without exception, he had won all 7 challenges. It was not like before, where he won the final victory by constantly recasting his sword will. Such a discovery made Ao Jian happy, and he was even more eager to know what he had experienced in the illusion of the sword will competition. With yearning, Ao Jian once again arrived at the central point of the Kendo domain. Not far away, the golden figure, transformed by the sea god's sword seal, was still standing on the surface of the water, and Sueya was sitting cross-legged not far away from him. Sueya suddenly opened his eyes when he felt an aura approaching. When he saw the familiar figure of Ao Jian, Sueya's face was filled with disbelief as if he had seen a ghost. "How have you been?" Ao Jian greeted him with a smile. How is this possible? The sea god's sword seal killed you. How did you do it?" Sueya asked in horror. "Do you want to learn? Let me teach you." Ao Jian teased. "Sueya, yes." This time, Sueya said without hesitation. Previously, Sueya could think that he had been careless and did not completely kill Ao Jian. When the rule came later and deprived the sword will, Sueya also thought that the rule of sword will had probed wrongly. Because other than this explanation, Sueya could not find a suitable reason to explain that Ao Jian could be resurrected after his death. However, this time, Ao Jian, who had been smashed by the sea god's sword seal, was resurrected again. Obviously, the reason that he had previously thought of could no longer be explained. At this moment, Sueya's heart was in turmoil. Therefore, when Ao Jian asked with a teasing look, "Do you want to learn?" Sueya said without hesitation, "Yes." Ao Jian was speechless. Looking at Sueya's serious face, the corner of Ao Jian's mouth twitched. He was joking, but it seemed that Sueya was serious. This made Ao Jian a little embarrassed, and he tried to change the topic. "How's your challenge going?" Sueya shook his head with a sigh. "My sword will can't compete with this rule of sword will unless I get the recognition of the consciousness left in the sea god's sword seal. Otherwise, I can't compete with sword will to succeed in the challenge. However, as long as I absorb all the sword will in the sword principle field, I will definitely be able to fight with it." Looking at Sueya's determined expression, Ao Jian asked in confusion, "Then why are you staying here instead of collecting sword will? Didn't I tell you? There is more than one way." You can also get the rule of sword will by getting the recognition of the sword seal. Sueya rolled his eyes. Sueya was no longer as cold to Ao Jian as before. This was because Ao Jian's invincible sword will had gained his recognition. Just like what he said before, if they were outside the field, he would definitely take Ao Jian in as a sword disciple and let him train with him. Moreover, Ao Jian had saved his life once, which Sui Yi remembered. However, he only remembered it in his heart and had a good impression of Ao Jian. As for the rule of sword will, Sui Yi would never give in. If he could, he would rather Ao Jian die. Have you been chatting with the consciousness left in the sword seal for the past few days to get close to it? Ao Jian had a strange look on his face. Sueya was speechless. Ao Jian's words seemed to have hit Sueya's sore spot, and his face gradually turned gloomy. Then continue with your work. I'll try again. As soon as he finished speaking, Ao Jian walked towards the golden figure again. Sueya did not stop him, but chose to watch from the side. Even if he was resurrected again, Sueya still did not think that Ao Jian could defeat the rule of sword will, and he was looking forward to Ao Jian being crushed by the sea god's sword will again. He did not believe that the heaven-defying resurrection ability could be repeated infinitely. Once again, Ao Jian came to the front of the sea god's sword seal incarnation. With anticipation, he gathered his sword will and challenged it. At this moment, the world in front of him began to collapse and reconstruct. When his vision became clear, he found himself in a world of yellow sand. At the same time, the memories that were sealed by Lu Wu in his mind came flooding back. Ao Jian suddenly came to a realization and understood what he had experienced in the illusion last time. This time, everything started over again. At this moment, Ao Jian suddenly understood the ultimate purpose of this illusion challenge. In a battle of sword will, naturally it was a competition of the strength of the sword will. He walked the memory path of the underworld sword lord. So if he wanted to defeat him, he must surpass him, instead of following the footsteps of his memory and passively accepting things. The last illusory realm challenge ended after the death of the previous underworld merchant guild's sword venerable. At that time, one of the 8 sword envoys had to be selected to inherit the position of sword lord. At that time, Ao Jian was the weakest among the 8 sword envoys, and in the decision of the Underworld Chamber of Commerce, Ao Jian was excluded from the list of candidates for the position of sword lord. It was also at that time that the illusion collapsed. At this moment, Ao Jian believed that it was because he did not obtain the position of sword lord. At that time, he did not reach the strength and status of sword lord. The 8 sword envoys were his limit, so he was determined to fail the challenge by the rule of sword will. Therefore, if he wanted to win in this sword will battle, he not only had to walk the memory path of the underworld sword lord, but he also had to surpass him and prove that his sword was better than that of the underworld sword lord. After understanding the reason, Ao Jian looked up at his surroundings. The sky was filled with yellow sand, and he squinted his eyes. Just like what he had experienced before, he suddenly felt thirsty, dizzy, and weak. However, a strong desire to survive burst forth in his body, so he did not collapse. However, he knew that it would not be long before an old man came to rescue him. At this moment, Ao Jian was like a cheat that could predict the future. Under normal circumstances, if one failed in the sword will battle, the challenger would definitely be killed by Neptune's sword will. Therefore, every challenger experienced the illusion path from the beginning. There was no advantage that they could take advantage of, and they did not know what would happen in the future. Even the sword will that they learned would be blocked by the rule of sword will, so they could only comprehend it from the beginning. However, Ao Jian was different. For him, death was only 3 hours away. Once again entering the illusion, the memories that he had experienced came back. At this time, Ao Jian had completely understood the subsequent development of the plot. Just as he thought, about half an hour later, the figure of an old man holding a plant vine appeared in the distance. He passed through the sandstorm and slowly approached him. A new plot had begun. The figure was as thin as a stick, and his steps were unsteady. However, the firmness in his eyes made Ao Jian's heart tremble. This feeling was familiar yet strange. The old man seemed inconspicuous, but his desire for the sea had affected him, or rather, the life of the underworld sword lord. A new journey had begun again. This time, Ao Jian was no longer passively receiving help. The last time he came, he had been watching the whole process with cold eyes. He had been guessing the reason for the illusion and analyzing all kinds of possibilities. However, this time he did not intend to sit still and wait for death. Along the way, he and the old man supported each other and moved forward together. Although there was no communication, they had used their lives to ensure that the other would survive. Along the way, they ate and slept in the open. All the plants and small animals that could be seen became their food. In the previous illusion, the old man had exhausted his strength in order to help Ao Jian. However, this time was obviously different from before. Because Ao Jian was no longer a burden, he tried his best to reduce the old man's burden and struggled to survive. After more than 10 days of rushing, Ao Jian and the old man were on the verge of death several times, but they finally survived. This time, the plot was completely different from before. After he and the old man climbed over the hillside, they saw the blue sea together. The breeze blew gently, and the sound of the waves hitting the reef and the sound of the seagulls above the sea intoxicated the two. This time, the memory did not jump with the death of the old man. Finally, they had reached this place together. Ao Jian turned his head to look at the old man who was staring at the direction of the sea. A smile appeared on his face. At least this time, he did not have the biggest regret of this illusion challenge. As for the success or failure of the later journey, he would continue. Chapter 699. As a veteran player of Battle Royale, Ao Jian had always been grateful to the game. That was why he never conspired with other players in the forum and called the Battle Royale officials a dog. The worst time was when he did not join the Acheron Chamber of Commerce in advance, but took the lead in competing with the 8 sword envoys in terms of lifespan. Subsequently, in order to better overcome the illusory challenge, Ao Jian even recorded all the important time points in his memory. Dog officials, what kind of rubbish plot is this? My liver hurts. However, he had no impression of the encounter in the 2 challenges. It was not easy to do so. Although the underworld swordsman was also average in talent, relying on his strong vitality and the ambition to build the Sea of Sword Heart to support his long cultivation journey. While waiting and growing, the underworld swordsman died as expected. However, in the face of the sword will of the law, Ao Jian could only say, "How delicious," and continue to work hard. The ability to predict the future, which was his biggest advantage, would no longer exist. What was different from the previous time was that Ao Jian obtained a place in the quota for the promotion to the Underworld Swordsman and received the support of many senior members of the Acheron Chamber of Commerce. This time, Ao Jian became the leader of Iron Snake Island in advance and began to lead the rise of Iron Snake Island. The difference was that there was one more person on Iron Snake Island. It was the old man who entered the sea with him. Ao Jian's idea was very simple. He adopted this group of wall-hanging children in advance and then instilled an idea into them. Although his talent was average, Ao Jian felt that he had a huge advantage in terms of lifespan. In the future, you must help your father to become a sword master. Otherwise, you will be unfilial. Your father is the most important person in the world. Being in the illusory world, Ao Jian set a goal for himself. The time for Ao Jian to work hard had arrived. Ao Jian even adopted a group of children in the illusory realm challenge this time. For example, Ao Jian originally wanted to give up building the Sea of Sword Heart and wanted to cultivate other sword wills. Perhaps the underworld swordsman did not expect that someone could play like this in the law of the illusory world and did not play according to his plan at all. Therefore, There was no notification of the illusory world breaking, and the sword will battle failing this time. The plot was still moving forward. In this regard, Ao Jian had his own speculation. However, all these were not worth mentioning as compared to Ao Jian's determination. Apart from the old man's continued existence, nothing else changed. He became one of the 8 sword envoys under Venerable Sword. Compared to the first time Ao Jian entered the Dreamland, he was much stronger now. It was not hopeless. Although time had skipped, the old man had not died. Instead, he had followed him to this place. In other words, the initial change in the plot had also changed the subsequent history. It had not been erased with the time jump. What Ao Jian had to do next was to face challenges and be challenged. He had to work hard to fight for the position of Swordmaster. This group of children had extraordinary potential, all of them making a name for themselves in the future, even using their own abilities to settle in the Central Sea region of Yellow Spring. This was also the end of his previous illusion. In order to make himself stronger, Ao Jian used all the tricks except for the main plot that could not be changed. Damn it, this is too cruel. However, there was one thing that Ao Jian could not change, and that was some key points in history. Because this body's unique characteristic was its exuberant vitality, he planned to drag them out and then join the Underworld Chamber of Commerce, waiting for the next fight for the position of honorable swordsman to obtain more opportunities for development. In fact, Ao Jian was also dumbfounded because he had once again forgotten what he had experienced. He only felt that he had become stronger. As for the growth of sword will, with so many cheating sons, Ao Jian felt that he could just lie down and take resources to cultivate. Ao Jian's speculation was gradually confirmed in the future. At the same time, Ao Jian had once again comprehended 2% of the rule of sword will. That was, he had to take the same path as the underworld swordmaster. The main plot could not be changed, but the side could be changed. However, 3 hours later, he was dumbfounded again. The moment he returned to the field of swordsmanship, Ao Jian was unsurprisingly killed by Poseidon's sword will on the spot. As long as it was a way to obtain a large number of resources and improve his strength, he would try it one by one. Sword will spiritual stones, incomplete sword steels left by ancient gods, peerless swords, etc. Ao Jian did not waste this ability. In the name of helping various forces to deduce the future, he earned a large amount of resources to develop his own forces. When there was no gaming chamber, playing games for more than 8 hours consecutively could be called playing hard. Playing games for more than 16 hours consecutively was called playing hard. At the moment of failure, the illusion was broken and the challenge failed notification appeared again. Apart from the necessary historical key points, Ao Jian could make all the other decisions by himself. Since he knew the development of this period of history, Ao Jian could always be one step ahead of others. He planned to cultivate in advance the superpower house that would be born in the sea area in the future and settle everything for himself. If he could not become the sword master, then the challenge would fail again, and he would have to start all over again. However, this time, Ao Jian's mentality was not as careless as when he first entered the illusion. He began to actively look for ways to become stronger instead of passively waiting for the moment to change his fate. For example, what kind of rare treasures would appear in a certain year, month, and place, what its specific function was, and how much help it would be to him. However, the consequence of doing so was a time jump. He appeared directly at the moment when he first cultivated sword will. He obtained a large number of resources to assist his cultivation and spent a huge price to forge a sword that matched his sword heart to improve his strength. Liver pain is liver pain, but I will definitely pass this stage. Therefore, with doubts in his heart, Ao Jian once again stepped into the field of swordsmanship and continued to challenge the law of sword will. After all, Ao Jian had lived n more lives than others. He felt that even if he was a pig, he would still be able to pass this plot. During one of the challenges in the illusion, He was even called the divine foreteller by the forces in the nearby sea area, because he could always predict the future and predict things like a god. However, it turned out that Ao Jian was still inferior to the sword users in terms of talent and the strength of sword will. Although only a few seconds had passed in reality, in the spiritual world, Ao Jian had experienced the path that the underworld swordsman had once walked, over and over again. These records were the cheats that Ao Jian opened in this illusion, which were very effective. However, at this moment, he could not help but curse. However, when he entered the illusion and the memories of the previous few challenges came flooding in, Ao Jian almost shut himself up. However, Ao Jian would not know anything about the future course of history. Sui Yi, who witnessed all of this, had a natural smile on his face. With the future prediction hack, Ao Jian began to deploy future plans in advance by relying on the memories in his mind. In the subsequent challenges, he was defeated consecutively. After his sword will was thwarted, he was finally disqualified from being promoted to the sword master. However, in the face of many things, the choices made by Ao Jian and the underworld sword master were different, which would inevitably affect the future development. At this moment, Ao Jian was like a protagonist who had activated the template. Your sons, I want them all. Everything was as he thought. Ao Jian could not bear the power of the law of sword will. After countless repetitive challenges, Ao Jian knew the future development of the plot like the back of his hand. That was to walk the same path as the underworld sword master, but to surpass him in sword will. Ao Jian did not feel that it was a big deal before the challenge. However, with the popularity of the gaming pods, the definition of hard work had also changed. At this stage, only players who stayed in the gaming pods for a month without going offline were called hard work players. Ao Jian tried all the ways that he could think of. For example, at a certain point in time, there would be an inheritance that would be beneficial to his cultivation of sword will, and so on in the subsequent training. Ao Jian waited for the sudden death of the underworld sword master, and then competed with the other 7 sword users for the position of the sword master. Chapter 700. At this moment, a son who had just finished reporting his recent achievements suddenly looked at Ao Jian with a solemn expression and said, "It's like this, Dad. In fact, in addition to the inherent resources, there is another very important thing that limits our development, which is the constraints of the Underworld Chamber of Commerce. Their trade rules are too overbearing. All our trading activities with the outer sea must pay taxes. This practice of the Underworld Chamber of Commerce really makes my brothers, and I feel aggrieved. I want to challenge the Underworld Chamber of Commerce, overthrow their rule, and replace them." Such a large amount of resources made Ao Jian smile from ear to ear. However, the development of the branch would not be affected. For example, the acquisition of resources was just like the experience and soul coins during growth, which could help him grow faster and had nothing to do with the main plot. The change of the main plot would lead to a time jump, which Ao Jian remembered in his heart. It was fine no matter how chaotic the branch was, but once the main plot was changed, it would inevitably be pulled back to the right time. In fact, the Sons of the Wall had privately mentioned the establishment of the Sea Realm dynasty to him, but Ao Jian rejected them as it was not the right time. "Dad, my brothers are here today. I want to discuss something with you." The Iron Snake Island force was already a powerful force that could establish a dynasty. It was even stronger than the Underworld Division. However, it would not be the case this time, because they had all become his adopted sons. With the help of the divine spiritual materials, the progress of his sword would be faster. At the same time, these sons would have a new direction to fight in. Fortunately, Ao Jian's brainwashing from a young age was very effective. He was still loyal to Ao Jian and carried out the words that Ao Jian always said. "It wasn't a waste of my efforts to bring you guys up." In their opinion, Ao Jian could completely establish himself as a king and have a broader future. Why should he be subservient and become someone else's subordinate? This time, Ao Jian's actions made him rise rapidly in a short period of time. In Ao Jian's memory, nearly 1/5 of them had successfully entered the Central Sea of the underworld and became a part of the Central Sea hegemony. As for the 8 sword envoys who might be his father's competitors, these sons of the wall had already secretly discussed with Ao Jian behind his back. Countless members of the Sea Realm forces came to celebrate his birthday. At the same time, his sons of the wall had also come from the outside world and brought Ao Jian's favorite sword with cultivation resources as a birthday gift. Many forces thought that Ao Jian's behavior of accepting sons everywhere was due to Ao Jian's character. It was a kind of eccentricity rather than any special purpose. After some contemplation, Ao Jian made a decision. At the beginning of the birthday banquet, the Sons of the Wall were reporting their recent achievements to Ao Jian. Ao Jian listened with a smile and nodded with satisfaction from time to time. When Ao Jian advanced to the late-stage Ghost Emperor realm, 8 of his sons had already advanced to the demigod realm. Each of the 32 armies under his command had made a name for themselves in the nearby sea area. I feel that with the current scale of our Iron Snake Islands forces, we can totally establish a Sea Realm empire. Only in this way can we speed up our development. What does Dad think? After experiencing so much, Ao Jian naturally knew what his sons were thinking. In the long development that followed, Ao Jian's power rose rapidly. Chapter 701. However, no one knew Ao Jian's secret. Therefore, Ao Jian's success started the era of fatherhood competition in the nearby sea area. The remaining 7 sword envoys chose to abstain and gave up fighting for the position of sword master. However, what Ao Jian did not know was that his adopted sons were rushing to the Netherworld headquarters from all directions in the Central Sea area. In the confrontation and competition, it was inevitable to encounter opponents that were difficult to match, and there would inevitably be unavoidable crises. However, the reality was that not only did Ao Jian not do so, he also chose to join the Netherworld Chamber of Commerce. This was undoubtedly unexpected for many sea area forces who were trying to figure out the future development direction of the Iron Snake Island. Other than the occasional visit from his adopted sons, Ao Jian even shut himself in. He would also think of the smiles on the faces of his deceased sons on his birthday, as well as the congratulatory words they said to him during the birthday banquet. Ao Jian did not have the strength to fight against them at all. After knowing the news, although they did not receive any notice from Ao Jian, they all started to rush to the Netherworld headquarters. Ao Jian. Therefore, Ao Jian's status in the Netherworld Chamber of Commerce became very special because of his adopted sons. It could be said that most of Ao Jian's children had the potential to settle in the Central Sea area of the Netherworld. They originally had great potential to build their own dynasty, and their adopted sons were all like dragons with infinite potential. They would definitely have a bright future. A young Baldy held his mother's hand and came to the Netherworld headquarters. After being examined, he successfully joined the Netherworld headquarters. This was because the other 7 sword envoys had higher talent and strength than him, and 5 of them had even broken through to the divine realm. At this time, Ao Jian's strength was close to the edge of the divine realm. It could be said that he was at the peak of his strength after several challenges in the illusory realm. However, in the face of this battle, he was still not confident. However, the forces in the Central Sea area were not affected by the heavenly phenomenon of breaking through to the divine realm. This was because the competition for the title of Sword Master could not be decided in a short period of time. During this period, they would have to go through several challenges, and the interval between each challenge was relatively long. They entered the various departments of the Netherworld Chamber of Commerce and began their own path of growth from the bottom. These sword intent spiritual stones were not formed by the heavens and earth. Moreover, they were already used to the heavenly phenomenon of breaking through to the divine realm. When Ao Jian consolidated his realm. The moment he came out of seclusion, he was dumbfounded to receive a piece of news. However, the Acheron Chamber of Commerce was about to usher in a revolution because of A.O. Jian's breakthrough. After all, his talent was limited. Aside from his vigorous vitality, he had nothing else. It would be rather difficult for him to win the final challenge. A.O. Jian also knew the reason, but he had forgotten which day it happened. They were well aware of their father's strength. Compared to the other 7 sword envoys, there was still a huge gap. If he didn't act now, he would be an unfilial son. When they received the news, the members of the forces in the nearby sea area could not help but sigh in their hearts. They felt that A.O. Jian had made a terrible move this time. In fact, it was just as A.O. Jian had thought. During the period of A.O. Jian's closed-door training, his adopted sons began to secretly coerce and bribe him in order to fulfill their father's wish. Although there were many super geniuses in the Central Sea who could fight beyond their level, A.O. Jian knew that he was definitely not one of them. Fortunately, he still had time. However, A.O. Jian, who was in seclusion, was unaware of all this after officially settling in the Central Sea region of the Netherworld. A.O. Jian became the disciple of the Sword Venerable of the Netherworld according to the plot and became one of the 8 sword envoys. At this moment, A.O. Jian was dumbfounded. He had never thought that the situation would change so drastically. There were less than a third of the nearly 200 adopted sons that he had brought with him when he first came to the Central Sea region. However, at the moment when A.O. Jian broke through to the divine realm, the persistence in their hearts was broken. After that, they took the initiative to find A.O. Jian's adopted sons to express their goodwill, expressing that they were willing to give up the competition. Today, although these adopted sons had not yet stepped into the highest position in the headquarters of the Netherworld, they were different from the past. They had already become the leaders of the various branches in the Central Sea region. In order to suppress this feeling in his heart, A.O. Jian devoted himself to the cultivation of sword will and no longer cared about anything in the outside world. Time flew, and 3 years had passed in the blink of an eye. On this day, the shadow of the sea god appeared and A.O. Jian's name was successfully engraved on the underworld god list. This was because there were many good seedlings among A.O. Jian's adopted sons who could break through to the ancient god realm. In comparison, it was clear at a glance which side was more beneficial. It was impossible for the higher-ups of the Netherworld Chamber of Commerce not to know about this, but they chose to turn a blind eye to it. The success learning that A.O. Jian had left to this sea region was destined to have a far-reaching impact. The Sword Venerable of the Netherworld had fallen. Moreover, A.O. Jian, who was only in the Ghost Emperor realm, was not worth mentioning in the Central Sea region and could not complete any high-intensity tasks. In other words, all the 8 sword envoys had chosen to give up except for A.O. Jian. The long period of time together had made him feel attached to them because everything was too real. In this regard, A.O. Jian immediately thought of his adopted sons and felt that they must have done something. Therefore, they naturally thought that their father was going to be bullied. However, when he came out of seclusion, he heard a lot of bad news. However, the reason why he could be so special was because of his adopted sons who were full of potential. It was their outstanding performance that supported A.O. Jian's current special status. Relying on the countless sword will resources collected by his adopted sons, A.O. Jian spent a whole 6 months to forcibly break through to the divine realm. However, A.O. Jian still suppressed the sadness in his heart and transferred all his energy to cultivation. A.O. Jian's method of success had also become an example for the members of the forces in the nearby sea region to learn from. This was because no one could predict that the adopted children would have a great future. Realizing that the hurdle had arrived, A.O. Jian no longer held back and took out all the sword will cultivation resources given by his adopted sons, the most precious sword will spiritual stones. However, this time, the news of the Sword Venerable's sudden death was really unexpected. In the last few challenges in the illusory realm, Ao Jian had always been stuck at this hurdle and could not break through. Of course, there were also some who succeeded and obtained part of the power in the Netherworld Chamber of Commerce and walked to a higher stage. However, they did not expect that in the end, they chose to live under someone else's roof. The Netherworld Chamber of Commerce did not keep idle people, but Ao Jian was an exception. He did not need to be distracted to accept the tasks assigned by the higher-ups of the Netherworld. Because he raised these adopted sons, he could be said to be extremely familiar with each and every one of them. This kind of life day after day, Ao Jian devoted himself to cultivation and no longer cared about worldly affairs. At this moment, the plot also began to move forward. As one of the 8 sword envoys, Ao Jian was about to face a challenge. More importantly, Ao Jian had already broken through to the divine realm. Even if his potential was weak, he could be cultivated. Therefore, they felt very helpless deep down in their hearts when their father had such an idea. After passing this hurdle, the next hurdle would be the bottleneck of the ancient god realm. This probability was very small. Even if one adopted hundreds of thousands of people, there might not be such a proud son. This time, the ambition in the hearts of the energetic adopted sons was finally put to use. Just like that, 1,000 years passed in the blink of an eye. Even if Ao Jian's adopted sons were talented, more than half of them were killed or injured in the continuous years of war. Although the Netherworld Chamber of Commerce did not amount to much in the Central Sea region, a superpower like the Netherworld Chamber of Commerce placed more importance on their future potential, not on the present. After all the forces of the Iron Snake Island moved away, a new journey in this sea area began. This was a magnificent era of fighting. Whoever's son was powerful could obtain the most precious treasures and the most resources. This time, Ao Jian was highly valued by the higher-ups of the Netherworld headquarters. This time, Ao Jian took out all of them just to break through to the divine realm. However, they did not dare to say it or advise in desperation. In order to avoid being remembered by others, they decisively bypassed Ao Jian when choosing their first opponent. However, what the higher-ups valued was not Ao Jian's personal ability, but his adopted sons with unlimited potential. They knew very well what this meant. It meant that one of the 8 swordsmen would become the new Sword Venerable and would receive the Netherworld headquarters' vigorous training. They would use all kinds of divine spiritual materials to help the new Sword Venerable break through to the divine realm and become an ancient god. In other words, he had completed the hurdle to become the Sword Venerable in the main plot. How could they not know about such a major event like the death of the Sword Venerable? However, in the face of the desire to become the Sword Venerable, they originally planned to grit their teeth and persevere. For this reason, they even took out their own wealth to buy people's hearts. However, the dead could not be resurrected, which left a sadness in Ao Jian's heart. Although they always thought that it was too difficult for their father to become the Sword Venerable with his talent. And that little bald head was Suya, who was known as the Bald Mentor by the players. Having received the notice from the Netherworld headquarters, Ao Jian finally led the Iron Snake Island forces to officially settle in the Central Sea area and became the Iron Snake Army under the Netherworld headquarters. They were responsible for guarding the resource islands and guarding the resource slaves. In the first year of settling in the headquarters, 3 of Ao Jian's adopted sons broke through to the divine realm. In the following years, more than 10 of them broke through to the divine realm one after another. Their future was limitless. The divine realm was a powerhouse in the outer sea area, but in the central sea area, they could not even determine the outcome of an ordinary battle for resources. Their value was limited. At this time, he was more concerned about the improvement of his strength and sword will. During the days of closed-door cultivation, Ao Jian finally broke through to the demigod realm. Ao Jian knew that his cultivation time was far from over. Therefore, Ao Jian became the new underworld Sword Venerable and received the support of a large number of divine spiritual materials from the Netherworld headquarters. The reason was very simple. Such potential had really shocked everyone in the Netherworld headquarters. The world was big, but his father's biggest idea had been deeply rooted in his mind since he was young. Even now it had not weakened at all. As the news spread, the entire Underworld Chamber of Commerce was shocked. However, before Ao Jian could break through to the divine realm, a new piece of news appeared. Ao Jian still walked out of closed-door cultivation. There were even two people who chose to give up directly as they were really shocked by the power of the adopted sons. At this time, Ao Jian was also ready to officially settle in the Central Sea area of the Netherworld. In the end, he once again stepped into closed-door cultivation and began to break through to the divine realm. He did not want to hear such news again, and even hoped to end the illusory realm challenge as soon as possible and leave this world. He led a large number of leaders to follow the trend and began to adopt children, wanting to replicate his legend. Ao Jian did not restrict the development of his adopted sons. He took the initiative to ask them to choose their favorite external department of the Underworld Chamber of Commerce and join it. From the initial Iron Snake Island force, it rapidly developed into the Overlord level force of the sea area. The rise of Ao Jian became a legend in the nearby sea area. In the first few illusory realm challenges of Ao Jian, the Seven Sword Envoys all chose the soft persimmon Ao Jian as their first challenge target and won the first sentence. Their arrival immediately alerted the other Seven Sword Envoys, except for Ao Jian. As for the cultivation resources of Sword Will, Ao Jian never lacked. When the adopted sons came to visit him, they would always bring a large number of resources to assist in the cultivation of Sword Will because they knew that their respected father liked this. Although his initial idea was to use these children to achieve his own goals, Ao Jian still had feelings for them after accompanying them for a long time. In order not to offend these leaders with great potential, the Seven Sword Envoys who participated in the competition for the Sword Venerable, like Ao Jian, were filled with helplessness. Time flew and the years flew by. However, every time there was bad news, Ao Jian would still think of the days outside the Central Sea area. Because they were only in the divine realm, although they were valuable, that was all. This time, they went to the headquarters aggressively. Even if they were not allowed to fight according to the rules, they were ready to help their father. During the days in the Underworld Chamber of Commerce, Ao Jian often heard the news of the adopted sons dying in the battle for hegemony in the Central Sea area. He also often heard the happy news of a certain adopted son making outstanding achievements for the Underworld Chamber of Commerce. Time flew, and tens of thousands of years passed in the blink of an eye. At this time, Ao Jian met an acquaintance. Even if they were talented and had unlimited potential, all the creatures in the Central Sea area were the same. The cruel competition was always accompanied by death, and they were no exception. They had heard of the rapid rise and powerful potential of the leaders, so they really did not want to offend them. Naturally, Ao Jian did not care about the criticism from the outside world. At this moment, Ao Jian's heart had aged a lot. Even if he was used to seeing life and death, he could not hold back the throbbing in his heart. At this moment, Ao Jian once again relied on his adopted sons to successfully rise to the top. Therefore, he had to seize the time and use the current resources and time as much as possible to improve his strength. Ao Jian had long been prepared for this. On the same day, he set up the Sword Spirit Formation near the island where he lived and prepared to break through. In short, Daddy can bully others, but whoever dares to hurt Daddy can just wait for death. In fact, with the current development momentum of Ao Jian's subordinate forces, all the forces thought that Ao Jian would eventually become a super force in the sea area and harvest a lot of resources. When he was strong enough, he would settle in the Central Sea area of the underworld. Although Ao Jian knew that all this was fake, he still felt a sense of vicissitudes. Moreover, the Underworld Sword Venerable was at his peak. No one knew how long he could live. Maybe the Underworld Sword Venerable would still be alive when they were all dead. Moreover, they knew very well that his father's dream was to become the sword venerable. Instead, it was transformed from the sword will of those powerful swordsmen after they died. Moreover, it was not inevitable. It also required a certain time and place, which was of great help to the cultivation of sword will. However, it was obvious that without the ability to predict the future, Ao Jian's legend in this sea area could not be replicated. Therefore, Ao Jian could not help but feel sad whenever he heard that his son had died. However, this time, the 7 sword envoys were shocked. Since the island where Ao Jian was located was inside the underworld headquarters, he was not worried that someone would come and make trouble. Therefore, he did not inform his adopted sons about this. Moreover, with the current development trend of Ao Jian's force, he did not even need to settle in the Central Sea area in the name of the Underworld Chamber of Commerce. He could completely rely on the scale of his own force to enter the Central Sea area for resource plundering. As time went by, Ao Jian's sword will also strengthen day by day. Chapter 702. On this day, a mother and son arrived at the underworld headquarters at the Central Sea region. On the day of her arrival, the woman submitted an application to the Underworld Merchant Guild to join them. The Underworld Merchant Guild did not immediately agree to the woman's application, even though she was already at the peak of godly state. As a superpower, the Underworld Merchant Guild had its own vetting system for accepting members. They would not easily accept outsiders who wanted to join them. Under normal circumstances, other than the members trained by the Underworld headquarters at the Central Sea region, most of the members who joined the headquarters were selected from the War Merchant Guild of the Underworld branches. It could be said that they knew everything about her, and it was impossible for her to be a spy sent by a hostile organization. Even when Ao Jian entered the Central Sea region in the name of the War Merchant Guild, he was also vetted. When Ao Jian submitted an application to enter the Central Sea region, the emissary sent it to the Central Sea region along with all the information about Ao Jian that the underworld had investigated. Where did he start? How did he establish his organization? How did he develop and rise? The underworld headquarters knew all of this information like the back of their hand. The vetting process could be said to be very strict. Therefore, even if the woman was at the peak of godly state, she still needed to be vetted. According to the information provided by the woman, the underworld headquarters immediately sent emissaries to collect information and conduct an investigation. At the same time, they collected information about the woman through various channels to ensure that there was no problem with the woman. The investigation lasted for half a year. When the emissary confirmed that the woman's identity was reliable and began to rush to the headquarters, an unexpected scene happened in the headquarters. For the past half a year, the woman had been staying in the underworld headquarters. All of her actions were closely monitored. If she made any strange movements, she might be killed by the internal experts. Fortunately, the woman seemed to be aware of this. She stayed in the underworld headquarters for most of her days and did not go out. However, the woman's body was deteriorating day by day. The member of the underworld headquarters who was responsible for monitoring the woman did not notice this at first. However, as the vitality of the island where the woman lived slowly faded and the plants withered, the member of the surveillance team immediately noticed that something was wrong and decisively reported the information to the headquarters. Soon, the investigation team in the headquarters received the information and came to investigate. The woman did not hide it anymore and chose to tell them about her body's condition. At that moment, the higher-ups of the underworld headquarters finally knew about the woman's condition. It turned out that the woman's body had already dried up and was no longer of any value. She hid in the Yellow Springs headquarters because she wanted to obtain the status of a member of the Yellow Springs Merchant Guild while she still had her strength. That way, even if he died, his future child would be nurtured by the Huang Quan headquarters and wouldn't have to wander outside and die at any moment. However, half a year had passed and the messenger had yet to return. She could no longer hold on. Knowing this, the Underworld Merchant Guild's investigation team in charge of investigating the woman's identity, immediately decided to expel the woman from the underworld headquarters. After all, the Yellow Springs headquarters still had their own rules. They would not keep any idlers around, except for Ao Jian. To be more precise, he would not raise worthless idlers. The woman who was on the brink of death had been categorized as a worthless idler by the investigation team. It was perfectly normal for him to be driven out. At this time, the emissary who had gone out to investigate returned and conveyed the woman's information to the investigation team. However, this information was now completely worthless. After looking through it for a while, the investigation team decided to banish the woman from the Yellow Springs headquarters. Right at this moment, the woman took the initiative to make a request. Before he died, he would help the Underworld Merchant Guild do one thing while he still had strength, even if it meant throwing his life away. Her request was simple. She wanted her child to stay in the Yellow Springs headquarters and be nurtured. Regarding such a request, the investigation team neither agreed nor rejected it. Instead, they chose to ask their superior. Soon, their superior replied to the woman's request. They could agree to it. However, the condition was to be in the north of the Central Sea region, where divinity was about to be born as an offering to the Underworld Merchant Guild in battle. This request was equivalent to sending the woman to her death and squeezing out her last bit of value. Regarding this request, the woman chose to agree to it without hesitation. However, before fulfilling this request, the woman hoped that her child's future could be guaranteed. He wanted to be apprenticed to someone in the Underworld Merchant Guild. Regarding this request, the higher-ups of the Underworld Merchant Guild chose to agree to it after some consideration. As for who to be apprenticed to, the higher-ups of the Underworld Merchant Guild would be very distressed. The 3 venerables, the 3 demon stars, the 6 earthly spirits, and so on, although there were many powerhouses in the headquarters, was not easy for these powerhouses to accept disciples. Either the disciple they accepted was similar to their own cultivation method, or the disciple was extremely talented. However, no matter how talented the disciple was, the lowest threshold was the Ghost Emperor realm. However, this woman's child was only an ordinary Ghost Soldier realm. He could not reach the threshold for these powerhouses to accept disciples at all. At this moment, someone thought of Ao Jian, who was only in the divine realm, but relied on his adopted children to climb up the ranks. Due to Ao Jian's current special status, the investigation team naturally did not dare to force Ao Jian to accept disciples. With the mentality of giving it a try, they found Ao Jian and made this request. When Ao Jian heard this news, he naturally wanted to reject it. After all, his plot had not developed to the end yet. There were still 2 most important thresholds. The first was to break through to the ancient god realm, and the second was to integrate all the water sword essences to forge the sword essence of the law. Therefore, Ao Jian had no intention of accepting disciples at all. Regarding this, the investigation team felt helpless, but they still chose to tell the woman the news. As a result, the next day, Ao Jian, who was in closed-door cultivation, met the woman who brought Sui Yi. She knelt down and begged him to accept the child. Ao Jian's heart did not waver because at this time, he did not want to train anyone except for cultivation. However, after seeing Sui Yi, Ao Jian inexplicably felt that he looked very familiar. That shiny bald head was too F*** eye-catching. Isn't this that after thinking for a while, Ao Jian still could not remember the specific name. He only vaguely remembered that it seemed to be called Bald Mentor. This could be said to be fate, or it could also be said to be an inevitable event in the development of the plot. Faced with the woman who was begging, Ao Jian sighed in his heart. He turned his head to look at Sui Yi, who was pulling the corner of his mother's clothes, and said, "Are you willing to be my son?" Before the confused Sui Yi could agree, the woman spoke first. She repeatedly said yes, and then pressed Sui Yi to kneel on the ground, making him kowtow to Ao Jian to acknowledge him as his father. After confirming the relationship between Sui Yi and Ao Jian, the woman left. However, she did not take Sui Yi with her when she left, but left him by Ao Jian's side. Although she was reluctant when she left, she knew that it was time for her to fulfill her promise. We will never see each other again. May your future be like a dragon. May your future be immortal. May your future be peaceful and without regrets. That day, Sui Yi cried loudly. Although he was young, Sui Yi knew very well that his mother was seriously ill. What his mother said before she left was more like a farewell. He had already realized that he was about to lose his mother. He was so sad about it that he even wanted to follow his mother's footsteps. However, Ao Jian stopped him and told him something. Without strength, you're just a burden. Remember to hate and take revenge when you're strong enough. That's what you should do. Ao Jian did not ask what Sui Yi had experienced, nor did he know the reason why his mother was seriously injured. He only told Sui Yi the importance of strength. With strength, one could do anything one wanted to do. One could use strength to save his mother, and one could use strength to take revenge. Strength was the foundation of everything. At that moment, the young Sui Yi had a vague concept of strength. After that, Sui Yi never saw his mother again. Ao Jian had also secretly asked someone to investigate this matter. When he learned that Sui Ye's mother was sacrificed as a sacrifice for the Acheron Chamber of Commerce, he chose to hide this matter and began to teach Sui Yi the sword. Sui Ye's talent in sword was extremely strong. There was an unyielding and free strength in his heart. His heart of the sword was more like a free sword. Compared to Ao Jian, Sui Ye's talent was much better. In a short period of time, he forged a heart of the sword that matched his attributes. In half a year, he broke through the Ghost Soldier realm and reached the Ghost Commander realm. During the contact, Ao Jian gradually developed feelings for Sui Yi, who was extremely talented in the cultivation of sword will. He even raised Sui Yi as his own child. Occasionally, he would give some resources to Sui Yi, allowing his strength to improve by leaps and bounds. However, Ao Jian also noticed all the flaws in Sui Ye's cultivation. That was, the hostility in his heart was still too strong. This would more or less affect the cultivation speed of his free sword will. After all, the disappearance of his mother had caused this child to suffer too much. Ao Jian could not change this. He could only hope that time could erase this memory. In the following cultivation, Ao Jian only had a little bald pendant by his side. Sui Yi also called Ao Jian father, like Ao Jian's adopted children. He regarded Ao Jian as his only family. In fact, Ao Jian would be lying if he said he was not envious of Sui Ye's cultivation progress. The time taken by Sui Yi to condense a sword was more than 10 times faster than Ao Jian. There were no bottlenecks in the early stage. In comparison, Ao Jian's cultivation speed could be described as the speed of a tortoise. This was not to say that Ao Jian's talent was extremely poor. The main reason was that the sword will that he cultivated did not match his attributes. There was even a state of conflicting attributes. Therefore, whenever Sui Yi asked to learn Ao Jian's sea sword will, Ao Jian would choose to refuse. This was because learning these sword wills with attributes would only limit Sui Ye's future development, which was disadvantageous to him. Ao Jian had already deeply understood this. Naturally, he did not want Sui Yi to experience the hardships and repeat the same mistakes. However, Sui Yi never gave up on this point. From time to time, he requested to learn the water sword will. From Sui Ye's point of view, the water sword will was Ao Jian's strongest unique skill. The other sword wills were only Ao Jian's side skills. They were not comparable to the main sword will. However, despite Sui Ye's repeated pleas, Ao Jian still did not choose to agree. Since you have become my son, then you should walk your own path and not copy my own path. It was the same for Ao Jian's other adopted sons. Although they were all taught by Ao Jian, they walked their own path and never copied his. Only Sui Yi, who had a strong desire for power, was an exception. Time passed in the process of cultivation and growth. The cultivation resources that Ao Jian received were increasing day by day. Gradually, there was the addition of divine spiritual materials. Divine spiritual materials were extremely precious spiritual materials, even in the Central Sea area. Ordinary members of the Chamber of Commerce were not qualified to use them. However, Ao Jian was different. As the sword master, he would regularly receive a batch of divine spiritual materials to assist in his cultivation. At the same time as the status of the adopted sons in the headquarters rose day by day, they were gradually qualified to receive divine spiritual materials. Apart from using these precious divine spiritual materials for their own cultivation, the adopted sons would often send some to Ao Jian when they visited him. Ao Jian could be said to be the most enviable existence in the Acheron Chamber of Commerce. Others had to fight desperately for divine spiritual materials. They put in a lot of effort and even lost their lives in the battle. Only Ao Jian was different. His current mission was to break through to the ancient god realm. In terms of divine spiritual materials, he had the support of both the headquarters and the adopted sons. This was the treatment that everyone longed for. However, Ao Jian's heart was not calm. Although he did not fight for these divine spiritual materials, the adopted sons were in the most competitive areas in the Central Sea area. They often encountered life and death crises. It could be said that these divine spiritual materials were stained with the blood of the adopted sons. It was not easy to obtain them. At this moment, Ao Jian was no longer as relaxed as he was when he adopted the adopted sons. Instead, he felt a heavy sense of guilt. At this moment, he only hoped to complete the plot challenge as soon as possible and leave this place. The days of cultivation were boring. Fortunately, he had Sui Yi to accompany him this time. Just like that, countless thoughts passed by. On this day, Ao Jian felt the arrival of a bottleneck. Long prepared, Ao Jian took out all the divine spiritual materials he had accumulated and began to work hard to break through to the ancient god realm. The news that Ao Jian was about to break through shocked the entire Acheron Chamber of Commerce. The ancient god realm was different from the god realm. It was the core combat power in the Central Sea area. The number of ancient god realm experts was the key factor to determine the strength of a force. Therefore, on the day of Ao Jian's breakthrough, many senior members of the Acheron Chamber of Commerce came to support Ao Jian. The heavenly sword formation was activated. Thousands of sword rays pierced through the clouds and sprinkled specks of starlight. As the formation operated, the divine spiritual materials inside were crushed and turned into a thick spiritual mist. The mist floated in the formation and wrapped around Ao Jian. It took him half a year to break through to the next realm. During this half a year, the senior members of the Acheron Chamber of Commerce did not leave the headquarters. They kept staring at the formation and looked forward to the birth of another expert in the headquarters. Ao Jian did not disappoint them. Although his cultivation speed was very slow and he spent more cultivation resources than others, his foundation was very solid. In the end, he broke through the extremely difficult threshold and stepped into the ancient god realm. At that moment, the chanting of the sea sounded in the Central Sea area. The shadow of the Acheron sea god descended and gave Ao Jian blessings for his advancement to the ancient god realm. His name also flashed with colorful light on the underworld god list and moved up. That day, Ao Jian spent the day in the congratulations of the members of the Acheron Chamber of Commerce. However, the next day, Ao Jian set foot on the road to the 6 paths of reincarnation. Although he had reached the ancient god realm, he did not have the powerful sword that matched the ancient god realm, which was the sword will of the law. The place near the 6 paths of reincarnation was also the area with the densest law aura. He wanted to condense his strongest sword will of the law there. After bidding farewell to his adopted children, Ao Jian set foot on the end of his plot. Beside the 6 paths of reincarnation, the praying soul flower bloomed. The air was filled with an intoxicating scent that made one's soul tremble and could not help but want to fall asleep. The further in he went, the more it was so. In such an environment, Ao Jian forgot about the time and devoted himself to cultivation. All the sword will of the water was crushed and recombined during the cultivation. Little by little, it merged with the sword will law in the heart of the sword and combined into his strongest sword will of the law. The moment the sword was formed, a stronger power of law floated out of the 6 paths of reincarnation and wrapped around Ao Jian. At that moment, Ao Jian comprehended the Acheron Sword Venerable's strongest sword, the Sea God Sword. At that moment, the illusion became blurred. The final battle that he imagined did not happen. Ao Jian originally thought that the illusion of the battle between sword wills was a battle between sword wills. The end of the plot would be the final battle between him and the Acheron Sword Venerable to determine who was the stronger one. However, the fact was that when he comprehended the Acheron Sword Venerable's strongest sword, he had already obtained the approval of the Sea God Sword Will. The illusion became blurred at that moment. Everything was like the moon in the mirror. The moment it touched, it was about to turn into ripples and disperse. At that moment, Ao Jian's figure flickered constantly. He controlled the Sea God Sword Will to bring him back to the Acheron headquarters in a flash. He wanted to see his adopted children one more time before he left. The scene around him became blurred. It was too late. His adopted children who were out on expeditions were not at the headquarters. When Ao Jian returned, he could only see Sui Yi, who had broken through the demigod realm. At that moment, Sui Ye's face was no longer childish. There was a sharpness in his eyes. It was familiar yet strange. Before leaving, Ao Jian took a deep look at Sui Yi, who was full of surprise. He sighed in his heart. Everything around him turned into nothingness at that moment. The illusion ended. At that moment, Ao Jian woke up from the illusion. At that moment, a teasing voice came from the side. "You've come back to your senses? You're going to die again." In Sui Ye's opinion, Ao Jian, who had come back to his senses, would be killed by the Sea God Sword Will. Upon hearing that, Ao Jian immediately turned to look at Sui Yi. The memory in his mind slowly faded at that moment, but it had not completely disappeared. Looking at Sui Ye's familiar face and his annoying expression, Ao Jian subconsciously frowned and put on a stern face. "How can you talk to your father like that? I'll punish you to kneel in the sword mound for 30 days. Sui Yi. Upon hearing that, Sui Yi was dumbfounded. "What did you just call me?" Sui Yi widened his eyes and raised the giant sword in his hand. Although he was extremely angry, Sui Yi did not know why, but he suddenly felt that Ao Jian was very similar to the Acheron Sword Venerable. This was because when the Sword Venerable was angry, he would often adopt this posture, and the punishment was to kneel in the sword mound. This made Sui Yi feel as if he had seen a ghost. However, he could not lose in terms of momentum. At that moment, Ao Jian's memory in the illusion had become extremely blurred and disappeared completely in the blink of an eye. At that moment, Ao Jian was also dumbfounded. Since he did not have the memory of the illusion, Ao Jian did not know why he would say such arrogant words. How dare he call himself father to Sui Yi, the peerless swordsman, who gave him the courage? However, no matter how hard Ao Jian tried to recall, he could not think of the reason why he would say such words. Although it was indeed very smooth, as if he had always called it that way, looking at Sui Yi, Ao Jian felt very sad. He could only say awkwardly, "It said that the memory of a fish only lasts for 7 seconds. I suspect that I'm in this state now, believe it or not." Chapter 703. Actually, if you're willing, I can teach you my understanding of the rule of sword essence. He grew up tenaciously and eventually used the sword essence in his heart to boil all the sufferings into sweet honey. Ao Jian didn't know about this part of history, but the players who frequented the forum were very clear about it. Then he quickly opened the friend list, clicked on Emo Lanlin's profile picture, and sent a message. He knew how tempting the rule of sword essence was to Sui Yi. It could be said that any swordsman could not refuse such a free opportunity. The rule of sword essence instantly disintegrated Sui Yi's sword essence. Logically speaking, he should be very unfamiliar with this strange power, and it would take him a long time to be able to use it. However, the fact was that he had already mastered this sword essence. Thinking of this, Sui Yi suddenly felt very sad. This sense of familiarity and intimacy made Ao Jian feel strange, but it felt very real. Will we die on the way? Did I really succeed in the challenge? At this moment, not far from Ao Jian Nemo, Xiaoxin, who was in the state of negative body, was quietly watching Ao, Jian, and Sui Yi. Therefore, Ao Jian still made his move. He immediately pressed his hand on Sui Yi's shoulder, and the rule of sword essence immediately surged into Sui Yi's body. It began to calm Sui Yi's trembling sword heart so that it would not break. Not to mention surpassing, just being on par with it was not something that ordinary people could do. At this moment, the white light that was condensed by the sword essence shattered inch by inch until it completely turned into light spots. Although every main plot of Ao Jian in the illusion was the same as Sword Master Amu, the two of them took a completely different path in every choice and branch plot development. The imagined plot of Neptune's sword essence killing Ao Jian did not happen. Instead, the golden figure transformed by Neptune's sword essence collapsed, revealing its azure blue body. With the surging of the power of the rule, Ao Jian's sword heart world gradually expanded and perfected. In a blur, two figures, one big and one small, appeared in front of him. This was because Ao Jian's sword essence was not worth mentioning at all. It could not even be compared to himself, let alone the rule of sword essence imprinted with the general outline of Sword Master Underworld. Obviously, Ao Jian did not defeat Neptune's sword essence in the sword essence competition, but Neptune's sword essence took the initiative to give the power of the rule of sword essence to Ao Jian. He was not reconciled to this and had questioned the sword venerable loudly. At this moment, Poseidon's sword was suddenly shattered, and the most original power of the rule of sword began to invade Ao Jian's body. At the same time, the consciousness of the underworld swordsman and the accompanying sword were completely shattered. At this moment, Sui Yi was still looking at Ao Jian with resentment, even though Ao Jian had helped him this time. This was an opportunity for Ao Jian. He had obtained the incomparably precious power of law. Although it was not the origin of law, it was still a supreme divine item that countless creatures in the underworld had been searching for. This was a glorious path of growth. The two of them finally stepped into the Central Sea region of the Yellow Springs. Under Sui Yi's incredulous gaze, the rule of sword intent slowly approached Ao Jian and began to dance around him. They set off from the sand-filled sealed area and walked step by step towards the future, pursuing that smear of blue. Amu also had the sea sword intent, but he felt that his sea sword heart was not worse than anyone else's. Because he yearned for the sea, his heart had a rock-solid sea sword heart. Moreover, Sui Yi knew that even if he did not make a move, the swordsman in front of him would still die. The subsequent path of growth was even more different. They were both cultivating, but Amu longed for power and becoming stronger more than Ao Jian. Even though he was an unfamiliar successor, he only left behind a wisp of the purest rule of sword intent, erasing all traces that he had imprinted on the rule of sword intent, which was the Poseidon's sword will. No, we have already gotten rid of the seal, and we will find a new home. For some reason, Sui Yi always gave him a sense of familiarity. If it was not for the rule of sword intent, he would not have been able to hold back the big sword in his hand and would have cut Ao Jian into pieces. They walked together, struggling to survive in the sand-filled world. They slowly walked towards the blue world in the distance and continued to move forward in the emerald world that was full of danger. Seeing this scene, Ao Jian's face turned solemn. I'm willing. According to the normal development, the next step would be the rule of sword intent killing Ao Jian. Without the characteristic of immortality, how many people could surpass Sword Master Mu on the same path? At that time, the majority of the players in the forum supported that the Underworld Sword Master was stronger than the venerable demonic ape because they listened to the live broadcast of the Underworld Sword Master's difficult and unyielding growth history. Ao Jian's realm did not improve because of this opportunity, but under the power of the rule of sword intent, all sword intents were subservient to him. Sui Ye's heart was filled with confusion. He suffered a blow to his heart, and his eyes gradually turned red. His sword heart was in disorder, and at this moment he was also wavering. When he heard Ao Jian say to Sui Ye that he was his long-lost son, Mo Xiaoxin was shocked. My dear mother, this is bad. Guess what shocking secret I found out. That scumbag Ao Jian, he hid it from you and had the surrounding mist of sword intent also gradually faded at this moment. As Ao Jian obtained the final rule of sword intent, the killing feast of sword intent competition ended prematurely. What he desired the most was to possess the strength of the sword master, and then find out the cause of his mother's death. This was because he knew that in order to achieve any goal, the foundation was to have sufficient strength. What's there? Taking a deep breath, Sui Ye tried to calm himself down. During this journey, Mu was not as lonely as Ao Jian. Ashu, who was by his side, had more potential than him. His pair of iron fists suppressed the strong enemies in the sea, and his high vitality allowed him to resurrect on the spot even if he was cut into pieces. Why? At this moment, Sui Ye's face revealed an indescribable excitement, but deep in his heart, he felt that it was a little unreal. Thinking of this, Sui Ye immediately said, however, the fact was that although the sword master treated him like his own son, he never taught him the essence of his sword intent. Instead, he let him walk a path that belonged to him. Affected by his emotions, his free sword intent was completely inconsistent with his current state of mind and was on the verge of breaking. As the field of swordsmanship dissipated, the sea returned to its original state. At this moment, Ao Jian was also dumbfounded. As his memory in the dreamland was completely obscured, he had no idea why he was recognized by the sea god's sword intent. The look in his eyes was like a senior looking at a junior, and it even reminded Sui Ye of the underworld sword master who had fallen. This was also taught to him by the sword master. This time he thought that the plot would remain the same and there would be no changes, but he did not expect the sword intent to recognize Ao Jian. He did not expect Ao Jian to say this because Ao Jian had no reason to help him. It's not a big problem. If you want to learn, I can teach you, but you have to pay a price. However, what he did not expect was that Ao Jian nodded readily and said, Mu, before you leave, you have to promise me that you must persist until the end and never give up. He slowly raised his hand to meet the white light and touched it. The starting point of this scene was a sealed place. As time passed, the seal was destroyed, and the two people who were sleeping woke up. At this moment, Ao Jian did not panic. Moreover, what made Sui Ye very uncomfortable was the way Ao Jian looked at him. This time, when the sword master fell, he thought that he was the most legitimate successor of the sword intent. He did not expect that all of this still did not belong to him, but to be obtained by an outsider. This was not a sad story, but an inspiring history of growth. However, for some reason, Ao Jian's heart resonated with it. Hearing this, Ao Jian had a strange look on his face. Instead, he chose the sword intent challenge. Although he was defeated by the Devil Ape Lord, this did not negate the strength of the Underworld Sword Master. He originally thought that Ao Jian wanted to give him the law of sword intent, but he did not expect that Ao Jian wanted him to comprehend it on his own. Moreover, he was sure that he did not win the battle of sword intent because the Poseidon's sword intent was still dazzling, and there was no sign of defeat. Thinking of this, Sui Yi sneered. Looking at Ao Jian, who was confident of winning, Sui Yi wailed in his heart. What Ao Jian obtained was the underworld sword venerable's fusion of all the sword wills and a wisp of sword wills from the 6 paths of reincarnation, which belonged to the source of sword wills. After struggling for a while, Sui Yi chose to agree to Ao Jian's request. This time he decided to learn the law of sword intent from Ao Jian. The law of sword intent that he mastered also made him rarely have a match in the same realm. As an ancient god, the underworld sword master was once one of the people at the top of the pyramid in the underworld. In fact, Sui Yi did not have much hope when he asked this question. After all, this ability was definitely Ao Jian's biggest trump card. How could he teach it to an outsider? This was a journey that was completely different from Ao Jian's. At the moment when Ao Jian entered the illusion, they were not far from the sea. They did not have to travel for as long as 3 years. Are you willing? Ao Jian smiled and continued to speak. I promise you, Ashu. These images faded in the end. As the consciousness left by the underworld sword master shattered. The memory hidden in the depths of the consciousness completely dissipated, and the images ended. This was because he did not feel any threat. At this moment, he was stunned. During this period, Ao Jian vaguely heard a conversation. At this moment, Ao Jian also came back to his senses. I have been the disciple of the underworld sword master all my life, and now I have to be the disciple of his successor? The thin figure held the other person's hand and looked up to ask. Ao Jian immediately turned his head and saw a flash of white light with a majestic sword intent slashing toward his head. In fact, as long as Ao Jian had watched the video released by reading more than 1,000 scrolls in the forum that explained the story of the underworld sword master, he would know some of the life stories of the underworld sword master. They had only known each other for a short period of time, but it felt like they had known each other for a long time. Looking at Sui Yi's furious eyes, Ao Jian knew what he was thinking and could not help but sigh. The truth was just as he thought. Every time Ao Jian challenged, he could not hold on for more than a few minutes. The result was that he was killed by the sword intent without exception. Just like how the underworld sword master did not let Sui Yi inherit his sword intent, he did not want others to continue on his path. Is that true? This power gave Ao Jian an illusion that he was the master of the sword and the master of thousands of sword intents. Hearing this, Sui Yi was stunned. I'm only passing on my understanding of the law of sword intent. As for whether you can condense your own law of sword intent, it's still up to you. See God's sword intent's action of getting close to Ao Jian completely shocked Sui Yi. Although his memory was covered, the understanding of sword intent remained in his mind. One of them had boundless life force surging in his body, while the other had a blue sword intent in his body. His story was more like a spirit. Looking at Ao Jian's awkward face, Sui Yi felt like killing someone. However, his smile soon froze. He felt that he would regret it for the rest of his life if he missed this opportunity. At the end of the story, the two who had accompanied each other from the beginning had reached the peak and arrived at the center of the Azure Sea. From then on, that place was their home, relying on Ao Jian's sword intent. Sui Yi's sword heart finally stabilized. This was because Ao Jian had taken away what he wanted the most. This hatred could not be erased with one helping. It was a deep hatred. In fact, the illusory challenge was the most difficult stage in the sword intent field. Apart from the law of sword intent, are you willing to teach me the supernatural power of resurrection? Are you really willing to teach me the law of sword intent that you have comprehended? It was also because of this battle that Amu was valued by the current underworld sword master and joined the underworld chamber of commerce. Thinking of this, Ao Jian's face was filled with shock and disbelief. You might not believe it, but I feel like you're my long-lost son. Of course. A large number of players began to move toward the central area where the sword intent field was originally, wanting to see what was there. Just like a sword that had been sharpened, it would finally shine and shine at the moment the sword was formed. Even though Ao Jian did not rely on his own strength to obtain the inheritance, he relied on the advantage of repeated memories to reach Amu's level, but he did not surpass it. Amu was not like Ao Jian, who chose to become the disciple of the Central Sea area. Although he did not collect all the sword intents, Ao Jian still completed the challenge with his immortality, which was equivalent to taking a shortcut to obtain the inheritance. At the same time, there was another person who shone during this journey. With the change of his state of mind, Sui Ye's sword heart cracked and was about to break. Hearing this, Ao Jian knew that things had taken a turn for the better, and a smile appeared on his face. Therefore, although Sui Ye's sword was strong, it was not worth mentioning in front of Ao Jian, who had mastered the law of sword. More importantly, he really wanted to know how Ao Jian managed to be reborn after death. Although Ao Jian had said something like, "If you want to learn, I can teach you," in Sui Ye's eyes it was just a joke. Impossible, go to hell. At this moment, an unwilling roar interrupted Ao Jian's thoughts. There's an endless water source. You'll never be thirsty again. However, the answer he received never changed. Looking at the broken sword intent, Sui Ye's face was filled with disbelief. At this moment, Ao Jian had obtained the most original power of the law, instead of the Neptune's sword intent of Underworld Sword Master. Water that can't be finished. That place is great. Therefore, he was not afraid of any sword intent. How is this possible? How did you do it? Sui Ye could not help but exclaim. They walked hand in hand, hungry and cold, but never gave up. The yearning for the sea was the driving force that kept them going. Such a sword intent competition was undoubtedly like mayflies trying to shake a tree, overestimating themselves. Could it be that, after inheriting the inheritance, even his personality was affected? Even if he did not want to admit it, the reality was that Ao Jian had obtained the inheritance left by the Underworld Sword Master and the sword intent of the law. Sui Ye was speechless. After all, he had tasted the consequences of being impulsive here several times. He did not want to lose the hard-earned sword intent again. Therefore, all of this was unrealistic to Sui Ye. He dared not believe that it was true. The moment he opened his eyes, a majestic sword intent rose from the bottom of his heart. Hearing this, Sui Ye's face immediately fell. It made Ao Jian feel as if he was one of them. It was very familiar, but also very vague. This journey lasted for 3 years. Why did you do this to me? At this moment, Sui Ye's sword heart was trembling. He was greatly agitated and obviously could not accept this. Bang! After his mother's death, he had been following the Underworld Sword Master as a sword disciple to pursue his sword principles. Chapter 704. 2 major events had taken place in the game recently, shocking the entire player community. The first was the server-wide announcement when Ao Jian obtained the rule of Sword Will. This event was like a magnitude 8 earthquake, completely shocking all the players. The players were already familiar with the rules of the game announcement. Usually, when a player obtained an inheritance or extremely rare treasure, it would only be a server announcement. However, the server-wide announcement was different. It was a game notification that rang simultaneously in all 5 servers. It was significant. At this moment, even the newbie players clearly knew that Ao Jian had obtained something extraordinary. Although they did not know what the rule of Sword Will was, it must be something more valuable than any inheritance at this stage. While the players were discussing about it, they also began to urge Ao Jian to quickly share the details of the interface in the forum so that they could enjoy it. Ao Jian did not hide it and shared the details of his rule of Sword Will on the forum. After the players saw the detailed description of the rule of sword will, they were completely excited. At this moment, they understood that the man who once stood at the peak of the Beiki cheat group had returned. Not only did he not fall from the altar because of his failure, but he had also become a stronger existence. The Beiki players were very happy about this because the cheat group was the face of a server. The stronger the players in the cheat group, the more face they would have. After all, when they were arguing with the players of other servers in the forum, they would often say, "Our cheat triple X is so awesome, crushing your triple X trash." The second event was the addition of the new NPC, Se. Before Sueye joined the Beiki camp, he was known as the bald mentor by the players. In the players' hearts, he was linked to opportunities. At this stage, many players had successfully comprehended the sword will with the help of Se and could be considered to have stepped into the threshold of a sword cultivator. However, the players always thought that the bald mentor would disappear one day. After all, there was no long-term opportunity in the game. Hence, they were very eager to find him and learn the method of condensing sword will from him. However, the players did not expect that the bald mentor would actually join Beiki and become a part of the Mansion of the Dead. This news was definitely a joyous occasion for the players, who said that there was no free lunch in this world. Wasn't this free opportunity to become stronger delivered to their doorstep? However, just when the players thought that they could comprehend the sword will from the bald mentor for free, another building appeared in the Mansion of the Dead. Sueye Sword Mansion. Upon entering the sword gym, the first thing the players saw was the eye-catching price list hanging on the wall. It was densely filled with the elective courses for various sword wills. At this moment, the players had mixed feelings. Damn it, I've learned another bad thing. Naturally, the players assumed that the bald mentor was just like Tonghua and the others. They had been corrupted by the stench of money and were no longer pure. Many players who hadn't received the lesson were in tears when they heard the news. When he stepped into the Kendo Pavilion and personally saw the exorbitant soul coins on the price list, he couldn't hold back his tears. This selfless gardener still fell at the feet of money in the end. This was 2F** King realistic. At this moment, the players couldn't help but think of the Wood Spirit race. When they first joined the Beiki camp, the Wood Spirit clan provided free medical treatment for the players. Furthermore, if the players wanted to drink Wood Spirit wine, they could just ask for it. The pure and kind ladies from the Wood Spirit clan would serve them the wine that they brewed themselves. As long as one's skin was thick enough, one could get anything they wanted in the Wood Spirit race, except, compared to the past, all the services provided by the Wood Spirit clan were now linked to soul coins. If one had no soul coins and wanted to suck up to the services of the Wood Spirit clan, the fierce ladies from the Wood Spirit clan would twist the top of one's skull off mercilessly. Even the newbie players who joined the battle did not believe that the greedy ladies from the Wood Spirit clan were calculative. Apart from their good looks, they were once very pure and kind. They thought that it must be a story made up by the old players to deceive the newbies. However, after witnessing the selfless bald mentor, Se, step onto the wrong path, some of the players who joined later felt a dull pain in their hearts. They had the same mentality as the old players when they saw the changes in the Wood Spirit clan. This evil soul coin, why isn't there enough to spend? Although the players were very sad that Sueye had completely changed, they still had to obediently fork out soul coins to buy lessons and attend the lessons regularly if they wanted to learn the sword will cultivation method. Among them, the one who benefited the most was naturally Lu Wu. He didn't expect Ao Jian to bring back a godly state master. His existence had a very important impact on the development of the players' forces. Especially during the current period of the sword will cultivation craze, it could significantly increase the combat power of the players. Since Sueye opened a sword gym in the Mansion of the Dead, Lu Wu, as the mastermind behind the scenes, would naturally get a cut. The price was not low. Most of Sueye's income went into Lu Wu's pocket. This time, Lu Wu obtained another way to earn soul coins without doing anything. At the same time, there was another piece of news that made Luwu very happy. The players of the Naraka server had finally built their own stronghold and successfully occupied a small area in the region where they were located. They no longer needed to wander around. Lu Wu generously allocated a sum of soul coins for the construction of the main city of the Naraka server. After all, it had been almost 4 years. Even the Fei Fei server had its own main city in the Xianfeng region. However, the Naraka server was still wandering around. Lu Wu couldn't stand it anymore. However, such a huge difficulty also brought opportunities for the Naraka server to develop. There were also many benefits. At this time, after years of development, the overall combat power of the Naraka server could compete with the European server. Of course, Reinhardt, who had a demigod mount, was a special exception. According to the current development trend, it was inevitable that the Naraka server would surpass the European server. This was a fact that the European server players had to admit, even if they didn't want to. In this regard, they could only think of ways to develop their own player forces and strive to continue suppressing the Naraka server. Now, the European server players had found a very good way. That was to follow the original players and freeload experience and soul coins. After tasting the sweetness a few times, the European server players generally had this mentality. Don't ask if there were any benefits. Seeing that the original players were moving out in large numbers, they could just freeload and be done with it. The healthy competition of the 5 servers indirectly increased the motivation of the players to become stronger. Everything continued to develop in a good direction. While the players were developing, the Sea King was also meeting his own turning point. Previously, when the Netherworld branch of the Devouring Sea started a war with the players, the Sea King thought that he had to make a decision and take a gamble. He would help the players in the battle against the Netherworld branch of the Devouring Sea. However, he didn't expect that the battle would turn into a war of gods. In the end, even the Netherworld swordsman fell. Not only did this exceed the Sea King's imagination, but it also exceeded the expectations of the Netherworld headquarters. In this regard, the Netherworld headquarters had already mobilized manpower to prepare for war with the player clan. However, this preparation could not be completed in a short time. According to the usual situation, once there was a force in the outer sea that resisted the Netherworld merchant guild's trade rule, the headquarters only needed to send a few gods to deal with it. However, this battle was different because even the Netherworld swordsmen had fallen in this battle. This was enough to prove the strength of the opponent. They had to be fully prepared. However, this preparation required a lot of time. This was because most of the headquarters' combat power was scattered in various resource points in the Central Sea. If they did not prepare in advance and mobilize manpower on a large scale, they would definitely be discovered by the enemy forces. It was very likely that the enemy forces would take advantage of the Netherworld merchant guild's weak defense to plunder a large amount of resources that belonged to them. Moreover, the higher-ups of the Netherworld headquarters were still not sure how strong the player clan was and how many people they should send to wipe them out. Therefore, everything could only be done slowly. As a super force that had stood tall in the Netherworld Sea for a long time, the Netherworld Merchant Guild's strategic vision had always been looking to the future. They would not make impulsive decisions because of a huge loss at the moment. This was also the reason why the Netherworld headquarters did not launch an all-out war against the players after the Netherworld swordsman's death. The Sea King was happy to see the headquarters' silence. After all, it was a great thing for him to freeload on the Netherworld Merchant Guild's resources and maintain a good relationship with the player clan. What surprised him even more was that the higher-ups of the Netherworld Merchant Guild were all escorted to the Central Sea as punishment and turned into slave labor. In other words, the higher-ups of the Netherworld Merchant Guild and the Netherworld Merchant Guild were about to be replaced with new blood. To the Sea King, this was a rare opportunity. With the Netherworld headquarters order, Eldering became the guild leader of the Netherworld Merchant Guild. However, the problem was that Eldering had long disappeared. No one knew if he was dead or alive. In other words, The higher-ups of the Netherworld Merchant Guild and the Netherworld Merchant Guild were a blank slate. Other than the emissaries from the headquarters stationed here, no one could order the Sea King, who was the War Merchant Guild. Even if the emissaries from the headquarters wanted to order the Sea King, they had to get the approval of the Devouring Guild leader. They did not have the authority to do so. However, the problem was that the Devouring Guild did not have a guild leader at the moment. According to this system, no one could restrain the Sea King. Moreover, according to the rules, the Sea King, as a member of the War Merchant Guild, had more authority than the middle-level officers of the Devouring Guild. In other words, the Sea King was now the highest authority in the Netherworld Merchant Guild. However, the middle-level officers of the Devouring Guild did not admit this. They believed that the War Merchant Guild and the Devouring Guild were two different organizations. Now that the higher-ups were not around, they should not interfere with each other. However, the Sea King had his own excuse to interfere. The reason was safety. When the top 10 War Merchant Guild and the higher-ups of the Devouring Guild were still around, they were extremely powerful. However, without them, the Netherworld Merchant Guild was not even as strong as some of the nearby sea forces. How could the Sea King miss such an opportunity? He ignored the protests of the Devouring Guild's officers and forcefully entered the Netherworld Merchant Guild. The Sea King, who had learned to be shameless from the players, gave an irrefutable reason. "I'm protecting you." Even the Sea King himself did not believe this reason, let alone the middle-level officers of the Devouring Guild. In the eyes of the middle-level officers, even if the Devouring Guild opened its doors, no force near the Devouring Guild would have the courage to harm them. To this, the Sea King gave his own explanation. It was better to be safe than sorry. After all, the Devouring Guild had accumulated such a large amount of resources in the sea. Who knew? Some force might be jealous and risk offending the headquarters to plunder. Therefore, for your safety, as a member of the War Merchant Guild, I must protect you. Faced with the Sea King's righteous reason, the middle-level officers of the Devouring Guild could not refute. The Sea King had said everything they could. What else could they do? They could only endure. After entering the Devouring Guild, the Sea King did not waste his authority. The first step was to mobilize a large amount of resources to build high-level warships. The middle-level officers of the Devouring Guild strongly objected to this decision. They thought that the Sea King was wasting important resources. However, the Sea King's reason was the same. Building so many high-level warships was a waste of time and effort. It was all to protect you. The middle-level officers of the Devouring Guild hated the Sea King for abusing his authority. They cursed him for being shameless, but they could not do anything to stop him. This was because they could not mobilize the Sea King with their authority, let alone remove him from his position. Although the Sea King could not mobilize the middle-level and lower-level officers of the Devouring Guild, he was still able to suppress them in terms of authority. During the development of the Devouring Guild, the Sea King was completely shocked by the huge amount of resources. He had never seen such an abundance of resources in his life. Sea spiritual materials, sea treasures, sea spiritual beast cubs, sea spiritual ores, etc. In order to obtain these resources, the Sea King began to come up with excuses. If they lacked warships, they would build high-level warships to arm their own Mute navy. The reason was that they wanted to become stronger to protect them. They had no selfish motives. If they lacked cultivation resources, they would plunder a batch of sea spiritual materials from the Devouring Guild for the soldiers' cultivation. For this reason, the Sea King even spent a large amount of spiritual materials to set up a spiritual cultivation formation on the island of the Devouring Guild. He allowed the soldiers to cultivate there permanently. The reason was still to become stronger and to protect the officers. If they lacked sea beasts, they would directly adopt a few of the most valuable beasts from the spirit beast enclosure. If they lacked armor, they would take a batch of spiritual ores from the resource warehouse. Thus, the Sea King began his lawless days. In short, he would take whatever he lacked. Moreover, his reason was very valid. The hearts of the people outside are unpredictable. Who knows? They might be gathering their strength in preparation to rob us. As the only member of the War Chamber of Commerce, I have to shoulder the heavy responsibility and protect your safety." In the end, the Sea King shamelessly added another sentence. "Even if I die, I will not let any harm come to you." The Sea King had completely lost his stern and rigid image as the overlord of the sea. He had been completely led astray by the players. The emissary from the headquarters, who was stationed there, saw the Sea King's various decisions. Although he was speechless, he did not stop him. This was because his mission was to report the development of the Devouring Guild to the headquarters. He would not interfere with any development issues. However, just as the emissary was about to report the recent happenings in the Devouring Guild to the headquarters, something happened that changed his opinion of the Sea King. Chapter 705. Hei Sui raised his middle finger in his heart when he heard the dog shamelessly asking him to be the judge. This reason might seem unreliable to the middle and lower level officers of the Devouring Branch, but they had no way to refute or report it. After all, the Sea King said this from the perspective of the Chamber of Commerce. Hei Sui was dumbfounded when he heard this. Some of the players on the forum saw that the title of the post was related to sea leaks, so they clicked on the post out of curiosity. After a moment of silence, Hei Sui looked at the dog and said, however, it was impossible for them to accept a 30-70 split. Hei Sui wanted to say the same thing if he could, but for safety reasons, he decided to leave before saying it. His life was more important. However, the expected look of gratitude did not appear. Everyone looked at him as if they were looking at a fool. "Are you done? Go on, I'm listening." At this time, Hei Sui said shamelessly. Hei Sui was speechless. Most importantly, it was not a difficult thing to do. "Actually, I know how you guys feel. How about this? I suggest a 40-60 split. I'll explain to the boss." It would be extremely difficult to obtain resources from these officers who were determined to do so. Crayon_Shinchan. "Opie, we understand. Hurry up and delete the video and post. Don't let those bastards from the European server find out. I'm seriously suspecting that there are many spies from the European server in the main forum." According to what Hei Sui said in the video, the Devouring Branch did not have any combat power. As the popularity of the post increased, Guyu and the others received the news. After 3 days of silence, the Sea King's plan gradually came to fruition. Hei Sui was speechless. Hei Sui thought he was very smart to say such a thing at this moment. A few days later, Hei Sui arrived at the Liuli coast from the Netherworld branch of the Devouring Sea. He found the players nearby and conveyed the Sea King's message. Therefore, the Sea King began to think of countermeasures on how to get resources from these stingy bastards. Not only did Guyu not appreciate it, but he also looked at him and said, other than meeting the quota set by the Netherworld headquarters, the resources that exceeded the quota could be kept for the development of the Devouring Branch, or they could be handed over as extra merits for the members of the Devouring Branch. "What are you looking at me for? Judge, isn't Sea Leak going overboard? Go!" Z continued to smash the ground with his claws. Because he did not have any authority to order these middle and lower level officers to listen to him. Moreover, they had chosen to defend the resource vault to the death. Was he really going to kill them? He put on an expression that said, "I'm listening attentively, yes, 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 you're right, you're right, you're right, you're right, but I won't speak." However, Hei Sui did not expect that the player clan would strike first and shamelessly say that 70% was too low. "What do you think of our proposal?" After interacting with them for so long, Hei Sui had always been aware of the player clan's ugly face and shameless behavior. Therefore, he did not speak at this moment. He only looked at the dog and Yi Shui, expressionlessly, his face filled with numbness. "Stars in the Universe, European server," replied to Crayon Shinchan. "Go to hell, Dog Shinchan." Evil Kingdom. JPG. However, as the Sea King continued to consume the resources in the resource warehouse, the middle and lower level cadres could no longer sit still. So everyone looked at him as if they were looking at an idiot. Soon, the news of the Sea King's intention to cooperate was spread to the official forum by the player who came into contact with Hei Sui. After knowing the news, the players were very excited. Faced with the players who had no intention of agreeing, Hei Sui said with a bitter expression, "Since you're going to be punished by Sea Leak, why don't you bear a little more?" In the vicinity of the devouring sea, which force dared to provoke the underworld Chamber of Commerce. Moreover, with their authority, it was impossible for them to suppress the Sea King, who was a member of the War Chamber of Commerce. After a while, everyone was silent as they stared at each other. After thinking about it, the Sea King felt that other than the idiotic player clan, there was no other force with the courage to do such a thing. However, now that the Sea King was consuming the resources in the warehouse, not only did it cause them to lose their extra merit points, they might not even be able to meet the next target set by the headquarters if the consumption continued. This deal could be said to be a guaranteed profit. Moreover, external threats were not easy to find. "I'm just a subordinate. I don't have the right to decide. When the boss instructed me, he said that you guys can only take 30%. As for your suggestions, I don't have the right to decide," Hei Sui said innocently. Faced with Hei Sui's intransigence, everyone was in a dilemma as he responded to all their suggestions with, "I'm just a subordinate. I don't have the right to decide." Gu Yu was speechless. The boss is currently stationed at the Devouring Sea Division. To avoid unnecessary trouble, he can't go out at this stage. I hope you can understand. Many of the guild leaders present were businessmen in real life. Although they were not as strong as the underworld creatures in terms of combat power, they were definitely experts in negotiation. Hei Sui had nothing to say to the shameless dog. Therefore, he needed a justifiable reason to use the resources. "I understand now. What he means is that we will apply pressure from the outside, and then the Sea King will come up with an excuse to take out a portion of the treasury resources to fight against us. Since he has already taken out his money, the officers who are guarding the resources will naturally have to follow suit. After getting these resources, we will put on a show for the war between us. At the same time, for safety reasons, we will temporarily keep these resources. When the time comes, the Sea King will return the money in full, and the officers will split the resources guarded by the officers 30 to 70. Brilliant! Of course, Hei Sui could only complain in his heart and did not dare to say it out loud. Shuali _ the strongest. Sea Leak is becoming more and more promising. Even so, he still knows to take care of us who are watching him grow like a father. I'm very comforted. Good leak. Good leak. Laughing emoji. Otherwise, according to the player clan's character, they would definitely agree shamelessly. They would even make him swear on his soul that he would not go back on his word at this moment. The players were very pleased. They felt that Sea Leak did not forget them when he was making a fortune. What a good leak. To protect you guys. Do you have to be so realistic? The Sea King was also very helpless towards the officer's behavior. After the plan was finalized, the Sea King began to wait for the player clan's reply. We've worked so hard to cooperate with Sea Leak, and he's only getting 70%? Isn't this a little too little? You promised to be our intimate Sea Leak and fatten us up in the future. Since when did you become so shrewd? Does this look like something a leak would do? After all, they could not snatch it by force. He could understand that everyone wanted to maximize their own benefits. However, the player clan was not trying to maximize their benefits. They were simply robbing. After listening to Hei Sui's complete explanation of the Sea King's plan, Lu Chai suddenly spoke. This meant that they would be busy from now on. The reward was what Hei Sui had mentioned in the video, which was to devour a large amount of precious resources in the Netherworld branch. The main reason why the officers in the Devouring branch were guarding the resource vault and not allowing him to mobilize them was because they knew that no one would dare to cause trouble even if the branch's defenses were weak. This was a rare opportunity. If they missed it, there would not be a next time. In fact, The Sea King had considered many potential risks before entering the Netherworld branch and using the Devouring Branch's resource, Vault, to arm himself. After watching the video attached to the post, Guyu, Lu Chai, and the others immediately arrived at the Lioli coast through the teleportation point in the Mansion of the Dead. They began to discuss the details with Hei Sui. There's a thing called acting tough. Boss taught me that. I hope you guys can carefully understand the meaning of this word. It's quite suitable for this situation. Hei Sui continued to speak expressionlessly. This was because the amount of resources in the resource vault was linked to their performance. After all, everyone who was struggling to survive in this world was so busy. If they could rob, they would not choose to negotiate. They had always talked with their fists. Soon, the post was pushed to the top by the players who discovered it. As more and more players joined the thread, it became a popular thread. This is so King infuriating. The 30-70 split was naturally 70% for the Sea King and 30% for the player clan. Invincible_loneliness. Sealik is so powerful. He's even going to the Netherworld branch to earn money. His undercover agent is almost becoming a boss. Ha ha ha, we're lucky. We didn't raise this leak for nothing. Watermelon_Taro. I think Sealik is getting more and more cunning. He used to be very wild. I still have the video of the Sea King bullying Cha Na a few years ago. Sealik was so domineering back then. He's not as cunning as he is now. As expected, men will learn bad things when they have money, power, and power. Laughing emoji. At this moment, Guyu and the others suddenly realized that Hei Sui had obviously become more cunning after interacting with him for a long time. He had actually learned the logic of silence being golden, and that the more one spoke, the more mistakes one would make. When these players opened the video attached to the post and heard what Hei Sui said, they were ecstatic when they learned about the Sea King's recent encounter and suggestion. During this period, the players nodded from time to time to express their agreement. This was obviously unrealistic. After all, in the eyes of these forces, the Netherworld Chamber of Commerce was the unshakable overlord of the sea. Anyone who dared to offend them would be courting death and could even lead to the destruction of their own forces. That's right, Sealik is too much. What can he do with only 70%? It's too little, it's not fair. Yi Shui followed the dog's words and expressed her opinion. The players' gazes were focused on Hei Sui, who was explaining the Sea King's plan in detail. Content. I won't repeat the details as it's too long. I've recorded everything that Hei Sui said. You can see for yourselves. By the way, please reply to me as soon as possible. Hei Sui is still waiting by the coast. It seems like we're going to make a fortune again. This is good news, laughing emoji. Yeah, I also think that the Sea King is a bit too much. I didn't expect you to think so too. The dog nodded seriously. How shameless. Why didn't he say that he would give all of it to you? Why don't we, the Mute Sea Nation, help you for free this time? There's good news from Sealik. Hei Sui is now waiting for his reply at the Lioli coast. Author. Endless Ocean. This was because the player clan had to participate in this plan. However, it was impossible for the Sea King to give up just like that. When he saw Lu Chai and the others who represented the player clan, Hei Sui immediately explained the Sea King's plan in one breath. He also explained the distribution of benefits after the plan was completed. As for why the player clan still existed, it was still a mystery to him and the biggest mystery to the Sea King. The forum was in an uproar as the players expressed their opinions on the matter. After all, the Underworld Chamber of Commerce was no joke. At the Lioli coast, a group of people were sitting together in a discussion with a serious expression. This time, he came according to the Sea King's instructions. The Sea King had also given him the distribution plan for the negotiation with the player clan. So they didn't come to avoid being exploited like last time. The only one who could fight against the players was the Sea King's spy. How were they supposed to fight? He suspected that the previous shameless forces were already extinct. That was why he did not meet them. The next day, the Sea King sent Sui to the Lioli coast to look for the player clan. This time, even if the Sea King told them all the reasons why they needed resources, they would not allow the Sea King to open the resource vault. They gathered in front of the various resource vaults and chose to defend them to the death. Looking at the arrogant Sun Chi, Sui suddenly understood why his boss would subconsciously blurt out whenever he was troubled. At this moment, they knew that the fattened sea leeks were about to feed them back. After that, no matter how the Sun Chi and the others attacked, Sui responded with silence. This was an opportunity for them to earn resources while lying down. Therefore, Sui decisively chose to remain silent. He used silence to counter the shamelessness of the Sun Chi and the others. He put on an attitude that said, "If you want to open the resource vault, you'll have to step over us to die." In terms of shamelessness, Sui felt that the player clan was already at the peak of the underworld. Therefore, the middle and lower level officers of the Devour branch could no longer tolerate it. When the middle and lower level officers chose to do so, the Sea King knew that his development welfare period was over. What the F***CK is this white magic dog? Roasting Chong, while hugging the jade rabbit. In the blink of an eye, it's almost been 4 years of war. Watching sea leeks grow up step by step, I feel a lot of emotions in my heart. It's like watching a child grow up from an old father. JPG, then call Sea Leeks over. I'll talk to him face to face. If he dares to disagree, I'll cut him up, the Sun Chi said arrogantly. Hearing this, the Sun Chi and the others were speechless. Therefore, in order to get them to voluntarily call out their resources and let them use them freely, they would need to be pressured by an external force. This would make them feel a sense of crisis and have no choice but to hand it over. If they did this, Chapter 706. Currently, the Underworld headquarters had a very high evaluation of the player clan's strength. Faced with such a situation, Guyu and the others decided to disguise themselves however they wanted after some discussion. They didn't need to be deliberate as long as they didn't look like a player clan. Therefore, the major forces in the Devouring Sea quickly gathered together and discussed how to fight against the Calamity tribe on Jingji Island. Although they planned to work together to fight against the Calamity tribe, no one wanted to be the main force and fight the Calamity tribe head-on. Crow takes a plane. Tornado destroys the parking lot. A warrior player who had transformed into Black Tiger, Fu charged forward as soon as he landed on land. Therefore, the leaders of the major forces were very curious about the Calamity tribe. After all, he was the one who suggested this. The players did this after careful consideration. In Xiaoqi even wrote a post on the forum to explain the reason. The war came faster than they had imagined. What's more, these players' avatars all corresponded to their skills. When they used their skills, they looked quite interesting. Come out, my soldiers. A player who had transformed into a Lich King stabbed the filial sun sword into the ground and activated the Bone Soldier summoning skill. Although the Sea King's orders were completed, the result was too different from the ideal. Therefore, after some discussion, they finally decided to disguise themselves as whatever they wanted. They were no longer unified as long as they weren't players. As soon as they entered the Devouring Sea, they immediately attacked the nearby islands. F***CK, White Magic Dog. For example, Starfish and Sponge, who were holding a net not far away. They had grown legs. At this moment, as the densely packed boats docked, the soldiers on the shore gripped their weapons tightly and held their breaths as they waited for the Calamity tribe's first appearance. The war had begun. 7 days passed in the blink of an eye. The well-prepared players had also arrived at the Devouring Sea. The difference was that they weren't the ones initiating the attack, but the Calamity tribe. However, the players were debating on what form to disguise themselves in the forum. Everyone had their own opinions. As for whether the enemy would understand, the players weren't worried at all. The Calamity tribe's actions of making enemies on all sides enraged all the major forces in the sea. At this moment, Sui realized that he wasn't strong enough in front of the player clan. He hadn't learned enough from the players. Numerous small boats detached from the player clan's battleships and sailed toward the shore. The amount of information was too large, and many warriors were instantly blinded by the colors in front of them. Just a moment ago, Hei Sui's expression was solemn, as if he was thinking for them. But now, his expression became extremely awkward. At this time, the coast was like a large-scale cosplay scene. Densely packed anime, movie, and game characters appeared one after another. According to the Sea King, they could not plunder and devour the Yellow Springs branch as a player clan. By the time these leaders reached the coast, the war had already broken out. On the surface of the sea, the player family's warships collided with the Sea Beast Army and warships of the various major factions, sending waves crashing into the sea. At this moment, while the leaders were furious, they also decisively began to command their subordinates to fight and disperse. As for the survivors, their descriptions of the Calamity race members were very vague. They didn't have a concrete image at all. However, what happened next left them dumbfounded. Therefore, Yin Xiaoqi's suggestion was to let the nearby forces know that the players were a force of plunder. Therefore, the players decided to beat up the nearby forces of the sea and loot some good stuff along the way. As more and more players leaped out of the small boats, various forms of players appeared one after another. It was a dazzling sight. As the saying goes, a powerful dragon cannot suppress a snake in its own territory. Usually, when foreign forces of the sea settled in, they would quietly develop for a period of time. After confirming that their foundations were stable, they would then compete with the surrounding forces for resources and expand their forces. This person was the player who ate the transmogrification fruit. After leaping out of the boat, this thunder elemental mage player shouted arrogantly, "Ha ha ha! Cry, shout, and then die!" A certain Shinibu player who had turned into a weakling said. Faced with the player's insatiable behavior, he suddenly didn't know how to deal with them. The leaders of the forces sat together and expressed their opinions and suggestions. Many of the creatures were creatures that these knowledgeable leaders who had lived for a long time had never seen before. They even felt that some of the creatures looked too abstract. As for the Calamity race, they only learned of it from their subordinates, who were lucky enough to survive. This was because there was a great deal of risk involved. The ferocious and ugly Calamity warriors that they had imagined didn't appear. The first to appear was a yellow-skinned big rat. It was completely different from the ferocious warrior that they had imagined. It was even a little cute. The first thing they did when they arrived at the Devouring Sea was not to attack the Devouring Underworld branch. Instead, to play it safe, they attacked the major forces of the Devouring Sea first. This time, the players who arrived had changed their identities and called themselves the Calamity race. They were a plundering force from the distant Kunlun Sea. They had originally wanted to take a closer look at the Calamity race. It was just a disguise. As long as they weren't recognized, it didn't matter what they looked like. After Hei Sui left, Guyu and the others started organizing people on the forum and got busy. Originally, the players were prepared to unify their forms for this battle so that they could disguise themselves as a single race. What was even more outrageous was that creature that looked like a raccoon. It kept taking things out of its pocket and distributing them to the creatures around it. How could such a small pocket contain so many things? They didn't expect the Calamity race to have no fixed form at all. It seemed like there were all kinds of races. Although they could tell that the Calamity race was extremely arrogant and tried to challenge all the forces in the Devouring Sea, they didn't expect them to be this arrogant. They actually dared to come when they were gathering for a meeting. Actually, they had already investigated the background of the Calamity race. However, in terms of brutality, the players were obviously a notch higher. Their arrival really caused the nearby forces in the sea to suffer. This way, they could maximize the benefits and make the officers of the Devouring Underworld branch continuously give up resources to help the Sea King defend against the enemies. At the same time, they would also eliminate any doubts. However, the players all had their own opinions on what they should disguise themselves as. They couldn't come to a consensus for a while. According to Guyu, Since they were going to be scolded anyway, they might as well bear more of it. The player clan will remember their contributions. As soon as he said this, all the leaders of the forces were shocked. At that moment, Wei was extremely sad. He knew that he would definitely be beaten up by the Sea King when he returned. In just 3 days, 2 islands had fallen, and the resources inside had been plundered by the players. Did you guys take a screenshot? Do I look cool? At that moment, the leaders of the various forces expressed their opinions and tried to fight for more benefits for their own forces. The final result of the negotiation was still 50-50, with the players taking 50% and the Sea King taking 50%. It was the same as the previous time. My turn to draw a card. It's you. Come out, Fire Elemental Giant. A certain elemental sorcerer player who had transformed into the Game King character also changed his appearance at that moment. He coolly drew a card from the device in his hand and began to cast the elemental summoning skill. After doing all this, the player immediately spoke in the party voice chat. Dragon-type creatures, soul-type creatures, humanoid creatures, beast-type creatures, undead creatures, and so on. Regarding this, the players expressed their opinions on the forum, expressing their opinions and suggestions. What identity should they disguise themselves as? After Wei said that he was willing to take responsibility and compromise, he thought that he would receive sympathy from the players. Therefore, to be safe, the players had to disguise themselves and fight the Sea King to a standstill. After all, from the Underworld headquarters point of view, even the Sword Lord had fallen in the hands of the player clan. How could the Sea King be defeated? At that moment, they could no longer sit still. Furious, they stood up and led their personal guards towards the coast. If they used the identity of the player clan to plunder the Engulf branch, it would be very suspicious if the Sea King successfully repelled the players' invasion. Underworld Engulf Ocean. However, the players did not express their gratitude. Instead, they took advantage of the situation and asked for another 10% concession. During the battle, the players would shout out their moves from time to time. Because of that, a battle that was supposed to be cruel was filled with joy and idiocy. In any case, as long as you're happy, that's all. We, the Calamity Race player clan, are a race full of idiocy and colorful. As for the issue of the profit distribution in the upcoming cooperation, it was finally settled after some discussion. At that moment, the leaders of the major forces on the island were completely dumbfounded. 100,000 volts. The main reason was that as an external force challenging the Underworld branch, it would be too obvious and suspicious. Clan leader, the Calamity Clan is attacking. Their fleet is approaching G Island. It was called the Transmogrification Fruit. After eating it, one could change their form for a fixed period of time. After all, there was no reward for putting in a lot of effort. If they suffered heavy losses, their own race would be in danger after defeating the Calamity Clan. At that moment, the major forces of the Engulf Ocean had gathered on G Island. In terms of disguise, there was a tool in the shop that could help the players. This caused dissatisfaction among the major forces of the Engulf Ocean. However, just as they were arguing fiercely, a few soldiers arrived in a panic. The major forces were usually considered to be extremely domineering in the Engulf Ocean. They used their fists to achieve prosperity for those who obeyed them, and annihilated those who defied them. Their goal was basically the same, which was to join forces and drive out the Calamity Clan that had recently invaded the Engulf Ocean. The specific content of the discussion this time was how the major forces should cooperate and divide the work during the operation to suppress the Calamity Clan. As soon as he finished speaking, electric arcs appeared on the surface of his body. Then the electric arcs began to spread in all directions, instantly blasting away many soldiers in front of him. However, they could not find any information about the Calamity Clan. They did not even know what the Calamity Clan looked like. Chapter 707. During the period of forcefully occupying the Central Sea area, the players had secretly contacted the Sea King while bullying the nearby sea forces. The reason why the players knew that the major forces of the Devouring Sea were discussing how to deal with them on Jingji Island was that the Sea King had sent his subordinates to inform them. After knowing the news, the players couldn't stay calm and all expressed that they wanted to smash their heads. And so the players came. This time, the players' transformations included all the well-known characters from animations, movies, novels, and games. The strongest cosplay team in history was born. The scene of the battle was even more exciting. The Joker and Batman, who were once enemies, cooperated to fight against the enemy. Pleasant Goat jumped up and smashed the 5-meter-tall Sea Clan giant. Captain Jack Sparrow and his sailors sailed the Black Pearl ashore. Yi Sherwin transformed into a magical girl and cursed the enemies to turn into pigs. Crayon Shin-chan, who was in the negative mode, transformed into a Grim Reaper. Wherever he went, people died. There was also the orphan player who had just learned the sword will and arrogantly shouted Hazadok in the crowd. In the end, he was caught and smashed by the leader of a certain force. The scene was so beautiful that even Lu Wu, who was watching the battle from behind the scenes, was stunned. Why did a war that was supposed to be cruel become cute at this moment? However, the players didn't show any mercy during the battle. Their methods were extremely cruel. It could be said that the combat power of the players who relied on their enthusiasm was terrifying. Since the leaders of the major forces were having a discussion on Jingji Island, they didn't bring all the combat power of their forces. They only brought their personal guards. At this moment, they were in a very passive position. It was very difficult to resist the crazy group of players. Although they had decided to join forces, they hadn't discussed who would be the main force. Deep down, they hoped that others would contribute more, so they didn't unite into an unbreakable force. However, the players were different. Although there were constant infighting, they were very united against outsiders. Coupled with the fact that they didn't have to worry about death, their combat power was extremely strong. This was a one-sided war. In terms of numbers and combat power, the major forces that united were no match for the players. Soon, some leaders couldn't hold on anymore and immediately wanted to lead their members to retreat. This action was like a spark that immediately caused the leaders of the other forces to follow suit. Seeing the others retreat, they naturally didn't want to stay behind and be the scapegoats. They all wanted to retreat first while the other forces resisted, so as to minimize their losses. This gave the players an even greater advantage. The expressions of the cosplaying players gradually became more and more arrogant, and they all pounced on the fleeing armies of the Devouring Sea's major forces. The merry chase began. The scene was too beautiful to look at. This was especially true for the group of players who cosplayed as cartoon characters. They looked harmless, but when they chased after their enemies, their methods were extremely cruel. The leaders of the various major forces who were retreating were also cursing in their hearts. They had no idea how the Calamity Race had found out about their meeting. They had been beaten senseless in this battle. As far as they knew, all the forces in the underworld were basically made up of various races. For example, the Sea King's Mutesi nation was mostly made up of his own people or descendants who were related to him by blood. It was the same for the major forces that the players came into contact with. For example, the Rahu race, Corpse race, Nether race, and so on, even the super forces, such as the Netherworld Chamber of Commerce, were made up of many races. If the Sea King joined the Netherworld Chamber of Commerce in the future, then the entire Mutesi nation would become a part of it. There would also be many other races like the Sea King joining, forming a major force. However, when they saw the internal structure of the Calamity Race, they were completely dumbfounded. They were all individual creatures. At a glance, there weren't many creatures of the same race. It was simply unbelievable. To them, the formation of such a force completely went against the structure of the underworld forces. If they hadn't seen it with their own eyes, they would never have believed it to be true. Usually, before a battle broke out between forces, they would gather information on the opposing races in advance and study their weaknesses. After all, no matter how strong a race was, it still had its weaknesses. However, after seeing this so-called Calamity Race force, the leaders of the major forces completely gave up on this idea. How the heck were they supposed to study this? There were all kinds of them, and there were many that they had never seen in their entire lives. Study your ass. The leaders of the major forces were furious as they left the scene, cursing and swearing. The players gave up after chasing after them for a while. This was because their target wasn't the leaders of the major forces. Their main target was still the Sea King. In this battle, they wanted to use the name of the Calamity Race to send a message to the major forces of the Devouring Sea. We, the Calamity Race, are a plundering force. We are ruthless and don't talk much. This way, when the time comes to plunder the Netherworld Trade Union, it would be justifiable. After all, this was their line of work. They weren't targeting the Netherworld branch of the Devouring Sea, but all the forces of the Devouring Sea. No exceptions. By doing this, they could also minimize the risk to the Sea King. After a period of chasing and beating, the leaders of the major forces successfully led their remaining troops to retreat. The players had also completely occupied Jing-Ji Island. After the battle ended, the players started to rest and chat. Some even took pictures with each other. After all, the transmogrification fruit wasn't cheap. While there was still time, they hurriedly took pictures as a souvenir. The cheerful and silly atmosphere spread once again. Next, the players had to wait for the Sea King's response. In the next few days, the Calamity Race became completely famous in the Devouring Sea. In the news that circulated, the Calamity Race was described as a powerful but extremely cruel force that came from the sea to plunder. Many of the weaker neutral forces trembled in fear. They were afraid that they would be targeted by the Calamity Race. After the battle on Jing-Ji Island, the leaders of the major forces of the Devouring Sea also hated the Calamity Race to the core. They all wanted to take revenge. However, they didn't dare to take the initiative to attack the Calamity Race. After all, they all understood the principle of the bird that sticks out gets shot first. The first to attack usually paid the greatest price. However, it was obviously impossible to make them submit just like that. Hence, the leaders of the major forces found another island and prepared to continue discussing the matter of the alliance. At the same time, for the sake of caution, they didn't make the matter of the alliance as public as before. They were afraid that the Calamity Race would find out again. After confirming the time and location, the new alliance meeting began. However, what they didn't expect was that the cosplay army came again. Once again, they cruelly destroyed their discussion. Faced with the Calamity Race, who always received news, the leaders of the major forces cursed and started to search for spies after being chased all the way. During this period, the leaders of the major forces of the Devouring Sea conducted in-depth investigations on their own members. They even accidentally killed a few suspicious members before stopping. However, just as they thought that everything was safe and that they could discuss how to join forces to fight against the Calamity Race, the cosplay army came again. In fact, the players were very clear about one thing. They were not afraid of devouring any forces in the sea. Although they weren't afraid of any forces of the Devouring Sea, it would still be extremely difficult for them to fight against the combined forces of the entire Devouring Sea. Hence, they could let these forces have the chance to form an alliance. The leaders of the major forces didn't expect that every time they held a meeting, the news would be leaked. It wasn't that there was a mole in their forces, but that there was a mole in the Yellow Springs Devouring Sea branch that they trusted. As the uncrowned king of the Devouring Sea, although the Yellow Springs Devouring Sea branch never interfered in the battles between the major forces, its position was above all the other forces. Hence, whenever the leaders of the major forces of the Devouring Sea held a meeting, they would symbolically invite the Yellow Springs Devouring Sea branch to join them as a form of respect, regardless of whether they showed up or not. However, they never expected that the Yellow Springs Devouring Sea branch had long since been taken over by the players. Every time the Sea King received an invitation to attend a meeting, he would inform the players immediately, even though he didn't have any intention of going. Once the players knew the time and location, they would also take the initiative to attack on time and disrupt the alliance plans. After this cycle repeated a few times, the leaders of the major forces started to have a mental breakdown. They could only continue to investigate which of their forces were the spies of the Calamity race. Many members with strange appearances also suffered because of this. They were interrogated to see if they were spies planted within the organization by the Calamity race. At this moment, those creatures with strange appearances were also having a mental breakdown. Was it wrong for him to look strange? Was he being reasonable? In reality, looking strange was a crime at this moment. One would be suspected of being a member of the Calamity race. Just as the leaders of the major forces were worrying about this and investigating the internal situation of their own forces, the Calamity race did something that really shocked them. At this moment, they were completely dumbfounded. They had seen many ruthless people in their lives, but this was the first time they had seen someone so ruthless. The Calamity race actually started a war against the Yellow Springs Devouring Sea branch. When they heard this news, the leaders of the major forces couldn't believe it. They thought that the information was wrong. Although the Calamity race was very powerful in their eyes, they were nothing compared to the Yellow Springs Trade Union. Daring to rob the Yellow Springs Trade Union, they were definitely dead. At this moment, the leaders of the major forces in the Devouring Sea region only had one thought in their minds. The Calamity race's path was narrow. There was no need to form an alliance now. They could just watch the show. The Calamity race would definitely be destroyed. They knew that the Yellow Springs branch had no higher-ups at the moment. Plus, there was only one war merchant left. The internal structure was empty and the defense was weak. They didn't have much combat power. However, there was no chance of winning against them. After all, the Yellow Springs headquarters stood behind the Devouring Sea region. That was a superpower that had a foothold in the Central Sea region. If it wasn't for the Yellow Springs headquarters, the Calamity race wouldn't even need to make a move. They would have taken the opportunity to take down the Devouring Sea region. The only thing stopping them from having such thoughts was the Yellow Springs Trade Union's headquarters, an insurmountable mountain. From their point of view, even if the Calamity race succeeded in robbing the Devouring Sea region, the final outcome would be the same. They would definitely be hunted down by the Yellow Springs headquarters, and their entire force would be wiped out. There were many examples like this in history. The miserable outcomes of the various overlords of the sea region made them understand this point. The Calamity race would definitely not be an exception. Their path was probably narrow now,